My wedding day was supposed to be the one afternoon of my life where my family finally chose me. Instead, I walked down an aisle flanked by empty wooden chairs on my side, while my parents and my sister wore tailor-made tuxedos and silk gowns at a lavish country club party they threw entirely to spite me. I smiled, I said my vows, and I signed the marriage license with a perfectly steady hand. By midnight, my phone screen was lit up with 47 missed calls and desperate weeping voicemails begging me for mercy. But I didn't reach for the phone to save them. I already knew their secret, and I knew exactly why the police were walking through their velvet-draped doors. I am Hannah. I am 29 years old, and I work as a commercial risk analyst. My job is to look at a ledger, find the hidden liabilities, and calculate exactly when a bad investment is going to collapse. I do the math so other people do not lose their shirts. But the hardest math I ever had to do was calculating the exact moment my own family became a liability I could no longer afford to carry. It was 9:00 on a Saturday evening in October. Downstairs, the reception hall was warm and loud. The bass from the wedding band was vibrating gently through the floorboards of the bridal suite. My new husband Thomas had just loosened his black bow tie. He was standing by the antique silver ice bucket, pouring us 2 glasses of champagne so we could have 5 quiet minutes to breathe before we went back down to cut the cake. The room smelled like white roses and vanilla fondant. I was sitting at the mahogany vanity, taking a single bobby pin out of my hair, feeling lighter than I had felt in my entire life. Then the buzzing started. My phone was sitting face down next to my makeup bag. It buzzed once, a long, harsh vibration against the wood. Then again. Then a continuous, relentless rhythm that made the vanity mirror rattle. Thomas stopped pouring the champagne. He looked at me, the bottle suspended in his hand. I did not rush to pick it up. I took a slow breath, smoothed the lace on my skirt, and turned the phone over. The screen was bright with notifications. 47 missed calls. I scrolled through the list with a perfectly still thumb. 18 calls from my mother, Patricia. 22 calls from my father, Richard. 7 calls from my younger sister, Lexi. The same 3 people who had spent the last 8 months telling anyone who would listen that my wedding was a selfish inconvenience. The same 3 people who had sent back their RSVP cards completely blank. The same 3 people who were at that very moment supposed to be 30 miles away at a country club clinking crystal glasses and celebrating the grand relaunch of my sister's luxury home staging business. Now they were blowing up my phone on my wedding night. And they were leaving voicemails. The transcription preview on the screen showed blocks of panicked text, no punctuation, just frantic rambling sentences. I tapped the most recent audio message. It was from my father. I set the phone on the vanity and tapped the speaker button, so the sound filled the quiet bridal suite. My father has always been a man who measures his words. He is a proud man, a man who cares deeply about how he looks to the neighbors and the people at his church. He is the kind of man who will wear a suit to the grocery store just in case he runs into the pastor. But the voice that came out of the speaker did not sound proud. It sounded breathless, terrified, and small. There was chaos in the background of the call. I could hear people shouting, the clatter of silverware, and a woman crying. It sounded like my mother, Patricia. Her weeping was high-pitched and desperate, the kind of crying she usually reserved for when she needed to manipulate a situation. But this sounded terrifyingly real. "Hannah, pick up the phone!" My father's voice pleaded, raw and shaking. "Pick up the phone right now. You need to call the bank. There has been a misunderstanding with the accounts. The caterers are locking the doors. They are threatening to call the police. You have to call the bank and authorize the deed transfer right this second, or your sister is going to jail. Hannah, please, you have to fix this." The message clicked off. The room went back to being quiet, save for the faint, steady bass of the band downstairs playing a love song. I sat perfectly still, processing the words. Not one word of apology for missing my wedding. Not one word wishing me happiness. Not even a simple congratulations. Just an order to call the bank to fix a mess to save my sister. Even now, even while his world was collapsing, my father was still treating me like the family vending machine. Insert panic, receive a bailout. For as long as I can remember, that was my role. I was the dependable daughter, the invisible safety net. When I was 23, I used my first corporate bonus to pay off my parents' maxed out credit cards so they would not lose their cars. When I was 25, I quietly co-signed a loan for Lexi's first car because her credit score was a disaster. Lexi was the creative genius, the golden child who was always on the verge of a massive breakthrough. I was just the calculator in the background, making sure the math worked out so she could keep chasing her dreams. I had spent my entire adult life setting myself on fire to keep them warm, and I had trained them to expect it. I had taught them that no matter how terribly they treated me, no matter how much they ignored my needs, I would always step in and write the check when things got hard. Thomas set the champagne bottle down. He walked over and stood behind me, resting his warm hands on my bare shoulders. He looked at my reflection in the vanity mirror. He has kind, steady eyes. He knew everything they had done to me over the last 8 months. He knew exactly why my side of the aisle had been nothing but empty wooden chairs today. Earlier that afternoon, when the church doors opened and I began my walk toward the altar, I had looked to the left. Row after row of polished oak pews sat completely vacant. No aunts, no uncles, no cousins. My parents had successfully guilted our entire extended family into boycotting my wedding to attend Lexi's gala instead. They had told everyone that my wedding was a deliberate attempt to steal the spotlight from Lexi's business launch. The people who shared my blood had made their choice. They chose the party over the bride. But as I walked down that aisle, I did not cry. I looked to the right where Thomas's family filled every seat. I saw his mother wiping her eyes with a tissue, his father beaming with pride, his cousins clapping softly. They had welcomed me with a warmth I had never experienced in my own home. They did not care about my bank account or my ability to solve their crises. They just cared about me. "Are you going to call them back?" Thomas asked, breaking the silence in the bridal suite. His voice was soft, completely devoid of judgment. If I had wanted to call them, if I had wanted to transfer my savings to save them, he would have stood by me. He is the best man I have ever known. I looked at myself in the mirror. I looked at the white lace of my dress, at the woman who had finally stopped shrinking herself to fit into a family that only ever loved her for her wallet. I remembered the sheer entitlement in my father's voice on the voicemail. He genuinely believed that even on my wedding night, I would drop everything, log into my banking portal, and sign away my future to rescue his favorite daughter from a felony. I reached out and swiped my finger across the screen. Delete. The voicemail vanished into the digital trash bin. I picked up the crystal flute of champagne Thomas had poured for me. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The bubbles were crisp and perfect. "No," I said, my voice as calm as a clear winter morning. "Let them drown. Let me explain to you how my family ended up facing a felony fraud charge while wearing luxury evening gowns. Let me tell you how people who share your blood can convince themselves that stealing your future is just another way of asking for a family favor. And most importantly, let me tell you how I stopped crying about being the unloved daughter and started using my skills as a risk analyst to build a trap they walked into entirely on their own. If you have ever been the dependable one, the one expected to quietly swallow your own milestones so someone else could pull up a chair, I want you to know exactly how good it feels to stop catching people who jump off cliffs just to see if you will break your own arms to save them. Drop a comment right now to let me know where you are watching from and what time it is, and be sure to hit that subscribe button, because this story is about to show you exactly what happens when the family bank finally shuts its doors for good. The real trouble started 8 months ago on a rainy Sunday evening in February. Thomas and I had just gotten engaged. We had saved diligently for 2 years to pay for the wedding ourselves. We did not want a massive, extravagant affair, just a beautiful, meaningful ceremony at our local church, followed by a nice reception for our closest friends and family. I had $25,000 sitting in a dedicated savings account, ready to cover the venue, the catering, and the dress. I drove to my parents' house to share the news. I walked into the kitchen wearing my new ring, feeling a cautious, fragile hope that just this once, my mother might actually be happy for me. Patricia was at the counter polishing a silver serving tray. Lexi was sitting at the island aggressively tapping on her laptop, looking stressed. I held up my left hand. "Thomas asked me to marry him," I said, unable to keep the huge smile off my face. "We are planning an October wedding. My mother stopped polishing the tray. She did not gasp. She did not drop the cloth. She just stared at my hand, her eyes narrowing slightly, running the calculations in her head. Lexi looked up from her laptop, rolled her eyes and sighed dramatically. "Wow, Hannah, great timing," Lexi said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "I am literally trying to save my business from bankruptcy, and you come in here flashing diamonds." My mother walked around the counter. She did not hug me. She took my hand, looked at the ring for 2 seconds, and then looked me dead in the eye. "We need to talk," Patricia said, her tone dropping into the serious, commanding register she used when she was about to ask for money. She pulled me into the living room away from Lexi and sat me down on the sofa. "Lexi's luxury home staging business is failing," my mother stated bluntly. "Her investors are pulling out. The warehouse rent is 3 months past due. She is drowning Hannah. She needs a cash injection immediately to rebrand and relaunch, or she is going to lose everything." I sat there, my heart sinking. I knew exactly where this was going. I had been down this road a dozen times before. "I am sorry to hear that, Mom," I said carefully, "but she needs to talk to a financial advisor about restructuring her debt." "She doesn't need an advisor. She needs her sister." Patricia snapped, her voice tightening. "You have that savings account, the one you have been hoarding for years. You need to transfer $25,000 to Lexi's business account by Tuesday." I stared at her. She wasn't asking. She was demanding. She wanted me to hand over every single dollar I had saved for my wedding, to bail out a sister who had never once paid me back for a tank of gas, let alone a business loan. "Mom, that is my wedding fund," I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could. "Thomas and I are using that to pay for our venue. I cannot give it to Lexi." My mother's face went completely cold. The maternal mask slipped, revealing the ruthless project manager underneath. "A wedding is just a party, Hannah. You can postpone it, you can go to the courthouse. Lexi's business is her livelihood. It is her future. Family sacrifices for family." I looked at the woman who had raised me. I thought about all the times I had sacrificed my own peace of mind to fix their mistakes. I thought about Thomas and the life we were trying to build together. And for the very first time in my 29 years on this earth, I found my spine. "No," I said quietly. "I am not postponing my wedding, and I am not giving Lexi my savings. My answer is no." Patricia stood up. She looked down at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. "If you won't support your sister when she needs you most," she said, her voice like ice, "then do not expect us to support your little ceremony. We are done here." I walked out of that house with my ring on my finger and my bank accounts intact. I thought I had simply set a boundary. I thought the worst they would do was give me the silent treatment for a few months. I had absolutely no idea that my refusal was about to trigger a chain of events that would end with my father screaming into my voicemail while the police walked into my sister's party. The drive home from my parents' house that evening was eerily quiet. I kept expecting my phone to ring, expecting my mother to call and berate me, or my father to text me a guilt trip about tearing the family apart. But the phone stayed dark. It was a suffocating, heavy silence, the kind of silence an army uses right before they launch a coordinated attack. I told Thomas what had happened when I walked through our front door. He just pulled me into a hug and told me we would pay for our own wedding, and that we did not need their approval to be happy. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But you do not grow up in a family like mine without learning to read the weather. I knew my mother. I knew her pride. She was not a woman who accepted the word no from the daughter she viewed as an ATM. She viewed my refusal as an act of treason. And Patricia did not just walk away from treason. She punished it. She orchestrated. She planned. I went to bed that night thinking the conflict was over, thinking I had successfully defended my wedding fund. I was completely oblivious to the fact that my mother was already drafting a blueprint for my total social humiliation. She was going to make sure that if she couldn't have my money, I wouldn't have a family to celebrate with. The trap was already being set, and I was walking right into it. The silence in my car during the drive home that evening felt heavy. It was not a peaceful silence. It was the kind of quiet that settles over a house right before a storm breaks the windows. I kept my eyes on the road. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. I was 29 years old, and for the first time in my life, I had finally locked the vault. I knew my mother was furious. I knew my father was disappointed. But the truth is, they were never actually disappointed in me as a person. They were disappointed that their primary funding source had just figured out how to say no. Growing up in our house meant learning your specific purpose early. Lexi was the artist. She was the golden child with big dreams and expensive taste. My parents looked at her and saw a genius waiting to be discovered. They looked at me and saw a safety net. I was the reliable one. The invisible daughter who kept her head down, got good grades, and never asked for a dime. I became a commercial risk analyst because I like things that make sense. I like ledgers that balance. But the ledger in my own family was rigged against me from the day I started working. When I was 23 years old, I received my very first corporate bonus. I was so proud. I had worked 60-hour weeks for a year to earn it. I drove to my parents' house to celebrate. Instead of taking me to dinner, my father sat me down at the kitchen table. He pushed a stack of past due credit card statements across the wood. He told me the interest rates were drowning them. He said my mother was losing sleep. He looked at me with sad eyes and said that a good daughter would step up when her family was hurting. I transferred every single dollar of my bonus to their accounts that very afternoon. I did not buy myself a celebratory dinner. I ate a frozen meal in my apartment and told myself I was doing the right thing. 2 years later, when I was 25, the pattern repeated. Lexi decided she needed a brand new luxury SUV for her image. She claimed she could not attract high-end clients if she drove a standard sedan. Her credit was a disaster. She had maxed out 3 credit cards on designer clothes and expensive lunches. The dealership laughed at her application. My mother called me crying. She said Lexi's entire future depended on this car. She begged me to just co-sign the loan. She promised Lexi would make every payment. I knew the math was terrible. I knew the risk. But I also knew the punishment for saying no was weeks of cold stares and whispered insults about how selfish I was. So I signed my name on the dotted line. Lexi missed the 3rd payment. I ended up covering the shortfall out of my own paycheck for 6 months just to protect my own credit score. That was my role. I was the vending machine daughter. Insert a guilt trip and receive a bailout. They never asked how my job was going unless they needed to know if I had gotten a raise. They never asked about my life unless they were trying to calculate what they could extract from it. I accepted it because I thought buying their peace was the only way to earn their love. But everything changed 8 months ago. The real trouble started on a rainy Sunday evening in February. Thomas had proposed to me the night before. We had been saving diligently for 2 years to pay for our own wedding. We wanted a beautiful ceremony at our church and a warm reception with the people we loved. I had $25,000 sitting in a dedicated savings account. It was the first time I had ever saved a significant amount of money entirely for my own joy. I drove to my parents' house that Sunday to share the news. I walked through the front door with my new engagement ring sparkling on my finger. I felt a fragile, cautious hope that just this once, my mother might look at me with genuine happiness. I wanted her to hug me. I wanted my father to smile and ask about the venue. I wanted a normal family moment. I walked into the kitchen. My mother was standing at the counter polishing a silver tray. Lexi was sitting at the island aggressively tapping the keys on her laptop. She looked stressed and angry. The air in the room was tight. I held up my left hand and smiled. Thomas asked me to marry him. I said the words and felt a rush of pure joy. We are planning an October wedding. The reaction was not what I hoped for. My mother stopped polishing the silver tray. She did not gasp in delight. She did not drop the cloth to come hug me. She simply stared at my hand. Her eyes narrowed as she ran quick, silent calculations in her head. Lexi looked up from her laptop. She rolled her eyes and let out a loud, dramatic sigh. "Wow, Hannah. Great timing," Lexi said. Her voice was dripping with heavy sarcasm. "I am literally trying to save my business from bankruptcy, and you come in here flashing diamonds." I lowered my hand. The joy in my chest evaporated instantly. My mother walked around the kitchen counter. She did not reach out to embrace me. She grabbed my arm tightly and pulled me away from the island toward the living room. "We need to talk," she said. Her tone dropped into that serious, commanding register she always used when she was about to ask for a large sum of money. She sat me down on the sofa and stood over me. "Lexi's luxury home staging business is failing," my mother stated bluntly. "Her investors are pulling out. The warehouse rent is 3 months past due. She is drowning, Hannah. She needs a cash injection immediately to rebrand and relaunch, or she is going to lose absolutely everything." I sat on the sofa and felt a familiar cold dread wash over my body. I knew exactly where this conversation was heading. I had been down this road a dozen times before, but never with stakes this high. "I'm sorry to hear that, Mom," I said carefully. I tried to keep my voice neutral and professional, but she needs to talk to a financial advisor about restructuring her massive debt. She needs to downsize her warehouse space. "She doesn't need an advisor, she needs her sister," my mother snapped. Her voice was sharp and tight. "You have that savings account, the one you have been hoarding for years. You need to transfer $25,000 to Lexi's business account by Tuesday morning." I stared at her in absolute shock. She was not asking for a small favor. She was demanding that I hand over every single dollar I had scraped together for my own wedding to bail out a sister who treated me like dirt. A sister who had never once repaid a loan or shown a shred of gratitude for the sacrifices I made. "Mom, that is my wedding fund," I said. My voice trembled slightly, but I forced myself to sit up straight. "Thomas and I are using that money to pay for our venue and our caterer. I cannot give it to Lexi." My mother's face went completely cold. The maternal mask she sometimes wore slipped away entirely, revealing the ruthless manager underneath. She looked at me not as a daughter, but as a stubborn subordinate refusing a direct order. "A wedding is just a party, Hannah," she said dismissively. "You can postpone it. You can go to the courthouse on a Tuesday and sign a paper. Lexi's business is her entire livelihood. It is her future and her identity. Family sacrifices for family, you know that." I looked at the woman who had raised me. I thought about the credit card debt I paid at 23. I thought about the car loan I covered at 25. I thought about all the times I had swallowed my own needs so they could live comfortably. Then I thought about Thomas. I thought about the life we were trying to build together. A life based on mutual respect and actual love, not financial extortion. For the very first time in my 29 years on this earth, I found my spine. It felt rigid and strong. The fear of their disapproval suddenly vanished. I realized that giving them my wedding money would not make them love me. It would only confirm that my happiness was permanently for sale. "No," I said quietly. My mother blinked. She leaned forward as if she had misheard me. "What did you say?" "I am not postponing my wedding, and I am not giving Lexi my savings," I said. My voice was no longer trembling. It was as solid as concrete. "My answer is no." Patricia stood up straight. She looked down at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. It was the look you give a stray dog that has ruined your carpet. The air in the living room turned freezing. "If you will not support your sister when she needs you most," my mother said, her voice slicing through the room like ice, "then do not expect us to support your little ceremony. Family sacrifices for family, Hannah. If you walk away from us now, do not bother sending us an invitation. We are done here." The line was drawn. It was a clear, brutal ultimatum. Give us your future or lose your family. They expected me to cry. They expected me to panic and beg for their approval. They expected me to open my banking app right there on the sofa and transfer the $25,000 just to stop the unbearable weight of their rejection. I did none of those things. I stood up from the sofa. I smoothed my jacket. I looked my mother directly in the eyes, and I walked out the front door without looking back. The rain was coming down hard as I walked to my car. I got inside, locked the doors, and started the engine. I did not cry. I just breathed. I had drawn my boundary, and I knew there was no going back. I thought I had simply stopped a bad financial transaction. I thought the worst they would do was give me the silent treatment and maybe skip the rehearsal dinner out of spite. I had absolutely no idea that my simple refusal was about to trigger a chain of retaliatory events that would end with my father committing federal bank fraud just to fund a party designed entirely to ruin my life. But that night, sitting in my car with the rain pounding on the windshield, I just felt free. I had finally stopped being the vending machine daughter. As I drove through the dark streets, my mind raced back through all the warning signs I had ignored over the years. The truth was, my parents never viewed my money as mine. They viewed it as a collective family resource that they were entitled to manage. When I got my first promotion at the firm, my father did not congratulate me on my hard work. He immediately asked if I was going to upgrade my car so he could borrow it for his weekend trips. When I moved into my own apartment, my mother did not help me decorate. She complained that I was wasting money on rent when I could be living at home and paying her mortgage instead. Lexi was entirely immune to this treatment. Lexi was allowed to fail over and over again, and every failure was treated like a beautiful stepping stone on her creative journey. When she decided to start the home staging business, she convinced my parents to empty their modest savings to buy inventory. She bought velvet sofas, marble coffee tables, and expensive modern art to stage houses that never actually sold. She rented a massive warehouse in a trendy district because she said the address mattered to high-end clients. But she had no clients. She just had a warehouse full of overpriced furniture and a rapidly draining bank account. And their solution to her massive financial negligence was always me. I was the fail-safe. I was the boring commercial risk analyst who could be bullied into writing a check whenever Lexi's dreams collided with reality. The rain continued to wash over my windshield as I pulled into the driveway of the small house Thomas and I rented. The porch light was on. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time before I turned off the engine. I replayed the conversation in the living room over and over. "A wedding is just a party, Hannah. You can postpone it." Those words echoed in my head. She had reduced my entire future with the man I loved to an inconvenient party that stood in the way of Lexi's warehouse rent. It was such a profound, casual cruelty. It was the kind of cruelty that only comes from someone who genuinely does not believe your feelings matter. I walked up the steps and unlocked the front door. Thomas was in the kitchen cooking dinner. It smelled like garlic and roasted tomatoes. He turned around and saw my face. He put the wooden spoon down and walked over to me. He did not ask how it went, because he could already see the answer in my posture. I told him everything. I told him about the silver tray and the laptop and the demand for $25,000. I told him about the ultimatum. "Do not expect us to support your little ceremony." Thomas listened quietly. He held my hands and looked at my new engagement ring. Then he looked at me and said the exact thing I needed to hear. "We do not need their money, and we do not need their permission. We are going to have a beautiful wedding, and we are going to pay for it ourselves. If they want to sit at home and be angry, that is their choice. But they do not get to steal your joy anymore." He was right. I felt a tremendous sense of relief wash over me. For the first time, I was not trying to fix a crisis that I did not create. I was letting the people who made the mess lie in it. But I underestimated their capacity for vindictiveness. I thought my parents would simply sulk. I thought they would withhold their affection to punish me. I thought they would wait for me to crawl back and apologize for being selfish. Because that is what I had always done in the past. I would hold out for a few weeks, feel the crushing weight of their disapproval, and then eventually break down and write the check just to make the coldness stop. They were counting on that cycle. They were counting on my lifelong inability to tolerate a quiet hostel room. They believed that within a month, I would transfer the money and beg for their forgiveness. But the days turned into weeks, and I did not call. I did not text. I kept my money in my savings account. I started looking at venues with Thomas. I bought bridal magazines. I started planning my life without consulting their ledger first. When Patricia and Richard realized I was actually holding my ground, they did not try to reconcile. They did not sit down and ask how we could move forward as a family. Instead, they changed their strategy. If they could not manipulate me into funding Lexi's business, they were going to make absolutely sure my wedding day was completely overshadowed and ruined. They could not accept that the invisible daughter was finally demanding to be seen, and they were willing to do whatever it took legally or illegally to put me back in my place. The line had been drawn that rainy Sunday night, and the war they started was about to cost them everything they owned. 4 weeks drifted by without a single demand for cash or another hostile phone call regarding my sister's failing business. I foolishly allowed myself to believe the storm had blown over, and that my boundary had finally been respected. My mother even called to invite Thomas and me to their traditional Sunday pot roast dinner. She sounded perfectly pleasant, casually chatting about the autumn weather, as if the vicious ultimatum in our living room had simply evaporated into thin air. I really should have trusted my gut. My daily work in commercial risk assessment relies heavily on spotting unusual patterns, and a sudden unearned truce is the biggest red flag in the manual. But deeply ingrained family dynamics have a dangerous way of overriding professional logic. You always want to believe that maybe just this once things will be normal. So Thomas and I bought a nice bottle of red wine and walked through their front door at exactly 5 p.m, hoping for peace. The dining room table was set with the good china, the delicate floral plates my mother only brought out for major holidays and visiting clergy. Lexi was already seated at the table, practically vibrating with a smug, contained energy. She wore a brand new silk blouse that I knew for a fact she could not afford on her current income. My father was pouring sparkling cider into crystal flutes, his chest puffed out with the kind of aggressive, boastful pride he usually reserved for bragging about his own rare promotions at the firm. The air in the room felt thick, heavily charged with an invisible buzzing electricity. I took my seat next to Thomas, placing my cloth napkin in my lap, waiting for the other shoe to drop. The roast beef was sliced, the mashed potatoes were passed around, and we endured 20 minutes of agonizing small talk about neighborhood property values and my father's golf swing. Then my father stood up. He clinked his heavy silver knife against his crystal water glass, a dramatic gesture he loved because it instantly commanded the attention of the entire room. He cleared his throat loudly and announced that they had monumental news to share with the family. Lexi was officially emerging from her temporary financial setback in a massive public way. He proudly proclaimed that she was hosting a spectacular relaunch gala and investor pitch for her home staging business. He beamed down at her, declaring that this was the exact moment she would secure the heavy capital she needed to take her creative genius nationwide. My mother reached under her chair and pulled out a stack of thick, heavy, cream-colored envelopes. She handed one across the table to me with a tight, manufactured smile that did not quite reach her eyes. The envelope felt incredibly expensive in my hands, made of heavy cardstock, with a custom wax seal pressed into the back. I broke the seal, slid my finger under the flap, and pulled out the card. It was letterpress printed with elegant, shimmering gold foil lettering. I read Lexi's name in grand calligraphy, detailing a lavish black tie event at a luxury historic estate venue across town. The invitation promised live classical music, a premium open bar, and a formal presentation of her completely revamped business model. Then my eyes dropped to the bottom line to check the scheduling. I stared at the numbers printed in that glittering gold foil. October 14th. My chest tightened so fast I completely forgot how to exhale. The air was sucked right out of my lungs. October 14th was the exact day I was walking down the aisle. I looked up from the heavy cardstock, my pulse pounding loudly in my ears. My mother was watching me intently, her expression perfectly composed, taking a slow, measured sip of her wine. My father was casually cutting a piece of meat on his plate, acting as if he had just handed me a grocery store coupon instead of a declaration of absolute war. They knew. They absolutely knew. They had a customized save-the-date magnet sitting proudly on their own refrigerator door for the past 6 months. I placed the gold foil invitation flat on the tablecloth right next to my dinner plate. I forced my voice to remain entirely flat, stripping it of the panic, the betrayal, and the hurt they were so desperately waiting to see. "Mom, Dad, this is October 14th, I said calmly, looking back and forth between them. That is my wedding day. Lexi immediately dropped her fork onto her plate with a loud clattering crash. Her lower lip began to tremble perfectly on command. Her eyes welled up with the kind of instant theatrical tears she had spent her entire childhood perfecting to get out of trouble whenever she broke a rule. "I knew you would do this," she whimpered, pressing a hand flat against her chest, like she had been physically struck by my words. "I knew you would try to make my biggest professional milestone all about your own ego. It was the absolute only weekend the estate had available, Hannah. I begged the venue coordinator for another date, but they were booked completely solid until next spring. I am literally trying to save my entire livelihood here, and you are making me feel incredibly guilty. It was a masterful, highly manipulative performance, but I knew it was a complete fabrication. You do not accidentally book a luxury estate venue on the exact same Saturday your own sister is getting married. I turned to my father, fully expecting him to at least acknowledge the massive scheduling conflict, to offer some sort of weak compromise. Instead, his face flushed deep red and he slammed his heavy hand down on the dining table, making the fine china rattle against the wood. Enough, he barked, leaning toward me with a furious, intimidating glare that used to terrify me when I was a teenager. Lexi's business is her livelihood. It is her career, her financial future, and the most important night of her entire life. Your wedding is just a party, Hannah. It is a single afternoon of you playing dress-up with your friends and eating expensive cake. You can easily call your little church tomorrow morning and change your date to November. She absolutely cannot change her luxury venue. The sheer breathtaking disrespect took my breath away. He was not just asking me to politely share the family spotlight for one busy weekend. He was explicitly demanding I erase my own life event, so my sister could have the entire stage to herself. He wanted me to call my vendors, lose thousands of dollars in non-refundable deposits, and rearrange my entire future simply because I had refused to hand over my wedding savings account to them 4 weeks prior. This was their calculated retaliation. This was the steep penalty for finally saying no to the family bank. If I would not fund her failing business out of my own pocket, they would make absolutely sure no one attended my celebration. Thomas reached under the table and squeezed my hand tightly. I squeezed back, deeply anchored by his steady, unwavering presence. He did not speak, but his touch told me everything I needed to know. I looked my father dead in the eye, and then I shifted my gaze to my mother, who was sitting there with a faint, satisfied smirk resting on her lips. She thought she had me cornered. She thought the social pressure of the dinner table would force me to fold, to cry, and to surrender my date. I am not changing my wedding date, I stated clearly, pushing my heavy wooden chair back from the table. The legs scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. My deposits are completely paid. My formal invitations are already out, and I am marrying Thomas on October 14th. If you choose to attend a fake business pitch instead of your own daughter's wedding, that is a decision you will have to live with. I stood up, took Thomas by the hand, and walked out of the dining room without touching a single bite of the roast beef. I did not raise my voice. I did not curse at them, and I did not shed a single tear in their presence. But the very moment the heavy oak front door clicked shut behind us, the family retaliation machinery kicked into high gear. My parents did not waste a single hour processing the fallout or considering my feelings. By the next morning, a vicious, highly coordinated smear campaign was actively tearing through our tight-knit church community and our entire extended family network. My cell phone started ringing before I even poured my Monday morning coffee. It began with my Aunt Susan, my mother's older sister. I answered, expecting a normal greeting. Instead, she immediately demanded to know why I was being so horribly unsupportive of Lexi during such a vulnerable, critical time in her career. I tried to calmly explain the timeline, pointing out that my date had been set for half a year. Susan cut me right off, her voice thick with righteous indignation, telling me that grace and forgiveness were far more important than a party calendar, and that a good Christian sister would step aside. Then came the barrage of text messages from my older cousins. They sent long, passive-aggressive paragraphs about how deeply sad it was that I was forcing my own parents to choose sides on a weekend that was supposed to bring everyone together. My parents were systematically calling every single aunt, uncle, and lifelong family friend, weaving a masterful, devastating narrative of my profound selfishness. They told everyone that I had deliberately chosen to keep my wedding on the exact weekend Lexi desperately needed local family support to save her failing company from total ruin. They painted me as a jealous, bitter older sister who refused to share the spotlight, conveniently omitting the vital fact that my church date had been locked in stone long before Lexi ever conceived of a gala. They mobilized the entire congregation against me, wrapping their intense cruelty in the wholesome, unassailable guise of a loving family, just trying to uplift a struggling young entrepreneur. The message broadcast to the entire town was crystal clear. Lexi was the innocent victim fighting bravely for her dreams, and I was the wealthy, heartless villain trying to sabotage her big break. The RSVP cards for my wedding began arriving in my mailbox a few days later. One by one, my aunts, my uncles, and the people who had watched me grow up checked the box marked gracefully decline. They were all going to the gala. My parents had successfully weaponized our entire social circle, leaving my side of the church aisle completely barren. They wanted me to feel isolated, to feel the crushing weight of their collective disapproval, so I would finally break and beg for their attention. But as the stiff formal rejections piled up on my kitchen counter, my mind snagged on a totally different detail. My parents were completely broke. They had been drowning in credit card debt for years, and Lexi was facing imminent commercial bankruptcy. Yet she had just booked a historic estate, hired a live band, and promised a premium open bar to hundreds of guests. I am a commercial risk analyst. I calculate capital expenditures for a living. I ran the numbers in my head while staring at the pile of declined invitations. I knew with absolute terrifying certainty that a gala of that magnitude cost at least $60,000. That kind of money does not just magically appear in the bank accounts of people who cannot pay their warehouse rent. Someone was funding this extravagant spectacle, and I was about to find out exactly where the money came from. The mail carrier usually arrived just after 2 in the afternoon in our neighborhood. For the first few weeks after mailing out our wedding invitations, that little metal clatter of the mailbox lid was the absolute highlight of my day. Thomas and I would sit at the kitchen island together, opening the thick ivory envelopes, tallying up the meal choices, and feeling the reality of our future solidifying with every single checked box. But exactly 5 days after that disastrous Sunday dinner with my parents, the nature of the mail fundamentally shifted. The physical envelopes looked exactly the same, but the messages tucked inside them had been completely poisoned. I remember the first one clearly. It was from my Uncle Robert, my father's older brother. He had always been the jovial, booming voice at our holiday gatherings, the man who used to slip me a $5 bill when I got straight grades in middle school and tell me I was going places. I slid my thumb under the flap of the envelope, fully expecting a warm congratulatory note. Instead, the RSVP card was blank, save for a single heavy black checkmark in the box, labeled gracefully decline. At the bottom, in his jagged, heavy handwriting, he had scrawled a personal note. It said he was deeply disappointed that I was forcing my own parents into such a heartbreaking position, and that a strong family supports its weakest links instead of selfishly competing with them. I stared at the blue ink until the letters blurred together. Before the shock could even fully register in my brain, my phone chimed loudly on the counter. It was a text message from my cousin Sarah, a woman I had shared a tent with at summer camp for 6 consecutive years. Her message was a long, self-righteous paragraph about how she could not in good conscience attend my wedding celebration, while Lexi was fighting for her professional life. Sarah told me I was being incredibly unsupportive and vain. She said that getting married was just a personal milestone, but saving a struggling business was a matter of survival, and I was genuinely cruel for refusing to share the spotlight with my own flesh and blood. Over the next 10 days, the slow trickle of rejections became an absolute avalanche. Aunt after aunt, uncle after uncle cousins. I had babysat as a teenager neighbors who had known me since I was wearing braces on my teeth. They all sent back their RSVP cards, marked with that same sharp, definitive decline. And the text messages continued to pour in, each one a slight variation of the exact same script my mother had masterfully distributed. I was called unsupportive. I was called a greedy bridezilla. I was accused of being blinded by my own ego of flaunting my financial stability, while my poor, highly creative younger sister was supposedly on the brink of absolute ruin. My parents had not just invited our extended family to a competing event. They had mobilized a dedicated, ruthless smear campaign. Patricia and Richard had spent hours on the telephone, crying to the congregation, weaving a devastatingly effective narrative. In their twisted version of the story, I had deliberately chosen my wedding date to sabotage Lexi's absolute last chance at saving her company. They conveniently erased the fact that my church date had been locked in with non-refundable deposits for half a year before Lexi ever dreamed up her ridiculous gala. To the entire town, Lexi was the fragile, brilliant underdog, and I was the wealthy, heartless villain actively trying to crush her dreams. They successfully guilted our entire bloodline into picking a side, and every single one of them picked the country club over the church. The rejection was a heavy physical weight. It sat directly on my chest in the mornings and kept me awake late into the night. I would look at the large seating chart I had carefully drawn up on a poster board, watching my side of the aisle empty out until there was almost no one left. There is a very specific, hollow kind of grief that comes from realizing the people you have loved your entire life can be turned against you with a few well-placed tears and a fabricated story. You realize with a sickening clarity that your place in their hearts was always highly conditional. I sat on the living room floor one Tuesday evening, surrounded by the growing stack of declined invitations, completely silent. Thomas came in from the garage, saw me sitting there in the fading light, and immediately sat down beside me on the rug. He did not offer empty platters of fake optimism. He did not tell me they would eventually come to their senses and change their minds. He just pulled me against his chest, wrapped his arms around me, and let me be deeply sad. But I was not left completely alone to deal with the wreckage. When my own family walked out the door, Thomas's family stepped right in, filling the massive void with a fierce protective warmth that I had never truly experienced before in my entire life. His mother, Barbara, drove over the very next morning carrying 2 heavy bags of groceries and a deeply determined look in her eyes. She did not offer me soft pity. She walked right up to my dining table, looked down at the decimated seating chart, and simply asked what tasks she could take off my plate today. Barbara completely took over coordinating the floral arrangements. She handled the endless calls with the caterer. His father, William, called me on my lunch break, just to say how incredibly proud he was to be gaining me as a daughter. He told me in a voice thick with genuine emotion that family is absolutely never defined by a shared last name, but by the people who consistently show up when the room gets dark. Thomas's siblings called, texted, and rallied around us, treating me with the kind of unconditional respect and joy my own parents had always stubbornly withheld. Their overwhelming kindness threw my parents' calculated cruelty into sharp, undeniable relief. I had spent 29 years auditioning for my mother's approval, constantly trying to earn a permanent seat at my own family's table by paying their past due bills and quietly swallowing my own pride. Now I was sitting in a warm kitchen surrounded by in-laws who just wanted me to be happy, expecting absolutely nothing in return. That realization was the major turning point for me. The suffocating grief slowly burned off, leaving behind a profound, unshakable resolve. I took a thick black marker and permanently crossed out every single empty chair on my side of the seating board. I did not need them. I refused to spend my wedding day nervously looking over my shoulder, hoping for the arrival of people who actively demanded I shrink myself just to make them comfortable. I told Thomas I was going to walk down that church aisle with my head held high, surrounded only by the people who actively chose to be there. We were going to celebrate our beautiful future, and we were going to do it without the heavy, toxic anchor of my parents' constant expectations dragging us down. I finally felt completely at peace with the empty wooden pews. But exactly a week later, that hard-won peace was abruptly shattered by a logistical detail that my professional brain simply could not ignore. I am a commercial risk analyst. My entire career is built entirely on identifying massive discrepancies in cash flow, spotting the hidden, dangerous liabilities that other people easily gloss over. I make my living finding the missing numbers in complex ledgers. Even though I was completely estranged from my parents and sister, at this point, small pieces of information still managed to filter through the social grapevine. One of my younger cousins, a college student who was smartly staying entirely out of the family war, innocently posted a screenshot of Lexi's official gala itinerary on her social media page. She thought the event looked incredibly beautiful and tagged the location. I was drinking my morning coffee when the bright image popped up on my digital feed. I tapped the screen and zoomed in closely on the details. My breath caught sharply in my throat. This was not a modest budget-friendly gathering in a rented community hall. This was not a scrappy grassroots business relaunch funded by a failing entrepreneur trying to scrape by. Lexi had booked the grand ballroom at the Oakwood Country Club. It is the absolute most exclusive, wildly expensive venue within 50 miles of our town. The printed itinerary proudly listed a premium 5-star catering company, a 12-piece live brass band, an open top-shelf liquor bar, and massive imported floral installations for every single guest table. I set my ceramic coffee mug down on the granite counter. The familiar cold hum of my analytical training kicked into high gear. I did not feel hurt anymore. I felt profoundly, deeply suspicious. I mentally itemized the true cost of the event based entirely on the premium vendors listed on that glamorous invitation. The ballroom rental alone on a prime Saturday evening in October was at least $15,000. The premium catering package for 200 guests was easily another $25,000. Add in the live entertainment, the open bar tab, the custom lighting design, the imported flowers, and the high-end marketing materials. I pulled a yellow legal pad toward me across the counter and started rapidly writing down the conservative estimates. I double-checked my math running the figures again just to be absolutely sure. This was at the absolute minimum a $60,000 production. I stared at the heavy black number circled at the bottom of the legal pad. $60,000. The math did not work. It did not even come close to working in any version of reality. I knew my family's financial situation intimately because I had been the one silently bailing them out of trouble for the past decade. Lexi's staging business was completely underwater. She was 3 full months behind on her commercial warehouse rent, and her business credit rating was completely destroyed. No legitimate bank or private lender was going to hand her a massive commercial loan to throw a fancy party. My parents were in an even worse position. They had been drowning in high-interest consumer debt for years. Their credit cards were perpetually maxed out. Their savings accounts were totally empty, and my father's fluctuating income barely covered their basic monthly utility bills. Just 1 month ago, my mother was desperately demanding my $25,000 wedding fund to save Lexi from imminent commercial bankruptcy. So how exactly does a family with zero liquid assets, terrible credit scores, and massive outstanding debt suddenly secure $60,000 in clean, readily available cash to throw a lavish country club gala? You do not accidentally stumble into that kind of money overnight. You do not put a party of that staggering magnitude on a standard credit card. The vendors involved at the Oakwood Country Club required massive upfront cash deposits to even secure the date. Someone had to write a very real, very large check to make this happen. I sat alone in my quiet kitchen, tracing the edge of the legal pad with my pen. The sudden miraculous appearance of this wealth was not a blessing. It was a massive financial anomaly. And in my specific line of work, an anomaly of this extreme size usually means someone is hiding a catastrophic risk. My parents had orchestrated this entire lavish event to spite me, to publicly humiliate me on my wedding day by stealing my guests. But the sheer scale of their retaliation revealed a terrifying underlying truth. They were completely broke, yet they were spending cash like lottery winners. Where did the money actually come from? The dangerous question echoed loudly in my mind, refusing to be dismissed. I knew my father. He was a desperate man who cared far more about keeping up appearances than dealing with reality. I knew my mother. She was a woman who firmly believed the normal rules did not apply to her if she wanted something badly enough. This was not just a spiteful petty party anymore. This was a massive glaring financial red flag waving directly in my face. They had found a huge pile of money, and given their lengthy history of financial mismanagement, I knew with chilling, absolute certainty that the money was not clean. I just had to figure out whose ledger they had secretly compromised to get their hands on it. The mail carrier usually arrived just after 2 in the afternoon in our neighborhood. For the first few weeks after mailing out our wedding invitations, that little metal clatter of the mailbox lid was the absolute highlight of my day. Thomas and I would sit at the kitchen island together, opening the thick ivory envelopes, tallying up the meal choices, and feeling the reality of our future solidifying with every single checked box. But exactly 5 days after that disastrous Sunday dinner with my parents, the nature of the mail fundamentally shifted. The physical envelopes looked exactly the same, but the messages tucked inside them had been completely poisoned. I remember the first one clearly. It was from my Uncle Robert, my father's older brother. He had always been the jovial, booming voice at our holiday gatherings, the man who used to slip me a $5 bill when I got straight grades in middle school and tell me I was going places. I slid my thumb under the flap of the envelope, fully expecting a warm, congratulatory note. Instead, the RSVP card was blank, save for a single heavy black checkmark in the box, labeled gracefully decline. At the bottom, in his jagged, heavy handwriting, he had scrawled a personal note. It said he was deeply disappointed that I was forcing my own parents into such a heartbreaking position, and that a strong family supports its weakest links instead of selfishly competing with them. I stared at the blue ink until the letters blurred together. Before the shock could even fully register in my brain, my phone chimed loudly on the counter. It was a text message from my cousin Sarah, a woman I had shared a tent with at summer camp for 6 consecutive years. Her message was a long, self-righteous paragraph about how she could not in good conscience attend my wedding celebration while Lexi was fighting for her professional life. Sarah told me I was being incredibly unsupportive and vain. She said that getting married was just a personal milestone, but saving a struggling business was a matter of survival, and I was genuinely cruel for refusing to share the spotlight with my own flesh and blood. Over the next 10 days, the slow trickle of rejections became an absolute avalanche. Aunt after aunt, uncle after uncle cousins. I had babysat as a teenager neighbors who had known me since I was wearing braces on my teeth. They all sent back their RSVP cards, marked with that same sharp definitive decline. And the text messages continued to pour in, each one a slight variation of the exact same script my mother had masterfully distributed. I was called unsupportive. I was called a greedy bridezilla. I was accused of being blinded by my own ego of flaunting my financial stability, while my poor, highly creative younger sister was supposedly on the brink of absolute ruin. My parents had not just invited our extended family to a competing event. They had mobilized a dedicated, ruthless smear campaign. Patricia and Richard had spent hours on the telephone, crying to the congregation, weaving a devastatingly effective narrative. In their twisted version of the story, I had deliberately chosen my wedding date to sabotage Lexi's absolute last chance at saving her company. They conveniently erased the fact that my church date had been locked in with non-refundable deposits for half a year before Lexi ever dreamed up her ridiculous gala. To the entire town, Lexi was the fragile, brilliant underdog, and I was the wealthy, heartless villain actively trying to crush her dreams. They successfully guilted our entire bloodline into picking a side, and every single one of them picked the country club over the church. The rejection was a heavy physical weight. It sat directly on my chest in the mornings and kept me awake late into the night. I would look at the large seating chart I had carefully drawn up on a poster board, watching my side of the aisle empty out until there was almost no one left. There is a very specific, hollow kind of grief that comes from realizing the people you have loved your entire life can be turned against you with a few well-placed tears and a fabricated story. You realize with a sickening clarity that your place in their hearts was always highly conditional. I sat on the living room floor one Tuesday evening, surrounded by the growing stack of declined invitations, completely silent. Thomas came in from the garage, saw me sitting there in the fading light, and immediately sat down beside me on the rug. He did not offer empty platters of fake optimism. He did not tell me they would eventually come to their senses and change their minds. He just pulled me against his chest, wrapped his arms around me, and let me be deeply sad. But I was not left completely alone to deal with the wreckage. When my own family walked out the door, Thomas's family stepped right in, filling the massive void with a fierce protective warmth that I had never truly experienced before in my entire life. His mother Barbara drove over the very next morning carrying 2 heavy bags of groceries and a deeply determined look in her eyes. She did not offer me soft pity. She walked right up to my dining table, looked down at the decimated seating chart, and simply asked what tasks she could take off my plate today. Barbara completely took over coordinating the floral arrangements. She handled the endless calls with the caterer. His father William called me on my lunch break just to say how incredibly proud he was to be gaining me as a daughter. He told me in a voice thick with genuine emotion that family is absolutely never defined by a shared last name, but by the people who consistently show up when the room gets dark. Thomas's siblings called, texted, and rallied around us, treating me with the kind of unconditional respect and joy my own parents had always stubbornly withheld. Their overwhelming kindness threw my parents' calculated cruelty into sharp, undeniable relief. I had spent 29 years auditioning for my mother's approval, constantly trying to earn a permanent seat at my own family's table by paying their past due bills, and quietly swallowing my own pride. Now I was sitting in a warm kitchen, surrounded by in-laws who just wanted me to be happy, expecting absolutely nothing in return. That realization was the major turning point for me. The suffocating grief slowly burned off, leaving behind a profound, unshakable resolve. I took a thick black marker and permanently crossed out every single empty chair on my side of the seating board. I did not need them. I refused to spend my wedding day nervously looking over my shoulder, hoping for the arrival of people who actively demanded I shrink myself just to make them comfortable. I told Thomas I was going to walk down that church aisle with my head held high, surrounded only by the people who actively chose to be there. We were going to celebrate our beautiful future, and we were going to do it without the heavy, toxic anchor of my parents' constant expectations dragging us down. I finally felt completely at peace with the empty wooden pews. But exactly a week later, that hard-won peace was abruptly shattered by a logistical detail that my professional brain simply could not ignore. I am a commercial risk analyst. My entire career is built entirely on identifying massive discrepancies in cash flow, spotting the hidden dangerous liabilities that other people easily gloss over. I make my living finding the missing numbers in complex ledgers. Even though I was completely estranged from my parents and sister, at this point, small pieces of information still managed to filter through the social grapevine. One of my younger cousins, a college student who was smartly staying entirely out of the family war, innocently posted a screenshot of Lexi's official gala itinerary on her social media page. She thought the event looked incredibly beautiful and tagged the location. I was drinking my morning coffee when the bright image popped up on my digital feed. I tapped the screen and zoomed in closely on the details. My breath caught sharply in my throat. This was not a modest budget-friendly gathering in a rented community hall. This was not a scrappy grassroots business relaunch funded by a failing entrepreneur trying to scrape by. Lexi had booked the grand ballroom at the Oakwood Country Club. It is the absolute most exclusive, wildly expensive venue within 50 miles of our town. The printed itinerary proudly listed a premium 5-star catering company, a 12-piece live brass band, an open top-shelf liquor bar, and massive imported floral installations for every single guest table. I set my ceramic coffee mug down on the granite counter. The familiar cold hum of my analytical training kicked into high gear. I did not feel hurt anymore. I felt profoundly, deeply suspicious. I mentally itemized the true cost of the event based entirely on the premium vendors listed on that glamorous invitation. The ballroom rental alone on a prime Saturday evening in October was at least $15,000. The premium catering package for 200 guests was easily another $25,000. Add in the live entertainment, the open bar tab, the custom lighting design, the imported flowers, and the high-end marketing materials. I pulled a yellow legal pad toward me across the counter and started rapidly writing down the conservative estimates. I double-checked my math running the figures again, just to be absolutely sure. This was at the absolute minimum a $60,000 production. I stared at the heavy black numbers circled at the bottom of the legal pad. $60,000. The math did not work. It did not even come close to working in any version of reality. I knew my family's financial situation intimately because I had been the one silently bailing them out of trouble for the past decade. Lexi's staging business was completely underwater. She was 3 full months behind on her commercial warehouse rent, and her business credit rating was completely destroyed. No legitimate bank or private lender was going to hand her a massive commercial loan to throw a fancy party. My parents were in an even worse position. They had been drowning in high-interest consumer debt for years. Their credit cards were perpetually maxed out. Their savings accounts were totally empty, and my father's fluctuating income barely covered their basic monthly utility bills. Just 1 month ago, my mother was desperately demanding my $25,000 wedding fund to save Lexi from imminent commercial bankruptcy. So how exactly does a family with zero liquid assets, terrible credit scores, and massive outstanding debt suddenly secure $60,000 in clean, readily available cash to throw a lavish country club gala? You do not accidentally stumble into that kind of money overnight. You do not put a party of that staggering magnitude on a standard credit card. The vendors involved at the Oakwood Country Club required massive upfront cash deposits to even secure the date. Someone had to write a very real, very large check to make this happen. I sat alone in my quiet kitchen, tracing the edge of the legal pad with my pen. The sudden miraculous appearance of this wealth was not a blessing. It was a massive financial anomaly. And in my specific line of work, an anomaly of this extreme size usually means someone is hiding a catastrophic risk. My parents had orchestrated this entire lavish event to spite me, to publicly humiliate me on my wedding day by stealing my guests. But the sheer scale of their retaliation revealed a terrifying underlying truth. They were completely broke, yet they were spending cash like lottery winners. Where did the money actually come from? The dangerous question echoed loudly in my mind, refusing to be dismissed. I knew my father. He was a desperate man who cared far more about keeping up appearances than dealing with reality. I knew my mother. She was a woman who firmly believed the normal rules did not apply to her if she wanted something badly enough. This was not just a spiteful petty party anymore. This was a massive glaring financial red flag waving directly in my face. They had found a huge pile of money, and given their lengthy history of financial mismanagement, I knew with chilling absolute certainty that the money was not clean. I just had to figure out whose ledger they had secretly compromised to get their hands on it. When a normal person finds a foreclosure notice stuffed in the back of an antique desk, their first reaction is usually panic. They cry. They call their spouse. They let the sheer terror of losing a family home wash over them until their knees give out. But I'm not a normal person, and I do not have the luxury of panic. I am a commercial risk analyst. I have spent my entire professional career examining ledgers, hunting for hidden liabilities, and pulling apart financial statements until the ugly truth shakes out of the numbers. When my eyes locked onto the bold black lettering from the bank demanding payment on a $350,000 home equity line of credit, my tear ducts stayed completely dry. My breathing slowed down. The emotional wounded daughter vanished, and the cold, calculating auditor stepped directly into the driver's seat. I stood in the dusty, sunlit attic of my late grandmother's Victorian house, listening to the old floorboards creak under my weight. This house was a sanctuary. It was the only place in my childhood where I was treated like a human being instead of a walking ATM. My grandmother had paid off the original mortgage 20 years ago. I knew this for an absolute fact because I had personally helped her file the deed of reconveyance when I was in college. She was fiercely proud of owning her home free and clear. There was absolutely no universe, no timeline, and no rational scenario where she would have ever taken out a massive six-figure loan against the only asset she had left to her name. I carefully slid the bank notice back into the manila envelope. I did not rummage frantically through the rest of the desk. I did not call my father to demand an explanation. Confronting a liar without a complete dossier of evidence is a rookie mistake. It gives them time to fabricate a defense, to destroy remaining documents, or to manipulate the narrative. I needed the raw, unadulterated facts, and those facts did not live in this attic. They lived in the county recorder's office. I walked down the narrow carpeted stairs, my hand sliding along the polished oak banister. Every inch of this house smelled like lemon oil and dried lavender, the exact scent of my grandmother. I was the only person in the family who bothered to come here anymore. My parents claimed the house was too depressing to visit. Lexi said the vintage decor gave her bad energy. The truth was that maintaining a property required actual physical labor, and nobody in my family was willing to lift a finger unless there was a direct financial payout involved. I locked the heavy front door, walked to my car, and drove straight toward the county municipal building. The morning air was crisp and bright, a beautiful autumn day that felt violently disconnected from the dark, churning calculations happening inside my brain. I drove in total silence. I was piecing together a timeline, aligning the dates of my family's sudden miraculous wealth with the dates of my own refusal to fund their delusions. 4 months ago, I had sat on my parents' sofa and firmly told them I would not surrender my $25,000 wedding fund to save Lexi's failing staging business. 4 months ago, my mother had told me I was dead to them. 4 months ago, Lexi was facing imminent commercial eviction. And now, exactly 4 months later, Lexi was hosting a $60,000 country club gala, and my grandmother's fully paid off estate suddenly had a $350,000 lien attached to it. The municipal building was a brutalist block of concrete sitting in the center of town. I walked through the metal detectors, my heels clicking sharply against the polished terrazzo floors. The air inside smelled of stale coffee floor wax and heavy bureaucracy. I bypassed the crowded lobby and headed straight for the property records department on the 3rd floor. I knew exactly which forms to fill out. I knew exactly which public terminals to use. I took a seat at a glowing computer station in the corner of the room, typed in the parcel identification number for the Victorian house, and waited for the server to load the chain of title. The screen flickered, populating a long chronological list of every legal action ever tied to that address. I scrolled past the original purchase date in the 70s. I scrolled past the mortgage satisfaction recorded 2 decades ago. And then sitting right at the top of the digital ledger was a fresh, glaring entry dated just 3.5 weeks after my Sunday dinner confrontation. It was a deed of trust, securing a home equity line of credit for $350,000. The lender was a mid-sized regional bank known for fast approvals and high interest rates. I clicked the link to request the scanned images of the actual origination documents. I paid the nominal printing fee at the clerk's desk and waited by the large industrial printer as the pages slid out one by one. The paper was warm to the touch. I carried the thick stack to a quiet wooden table in the back of the archives room, pulled a yellow highlighter from my purse, and began to read. When you look at a financial crime on paper, the sheer audacity of it is often more shocking than the theft itself. The documents painted a picture of absolute reckless malice. The borrower listed on the loan application was my deceased grandmother, but she had been dead for over a year. A dead woman cannot walk into a regional bank branch, sit down with a loan officer, and sign her name to a massive financial encumbrance. Someone had to sit in that chair. Someone had to hold the pen. I flipped to the signature page of the loan agreement. There, scrawled on the dotted line, was my grandmother's distinctive looping cursive. It was a very good forgery, but I had spent my entire childhood reading her handwritten letters. I knew the exact angle of her capital letters. I knew how she crossed her vertical strokes. The signature on this bank document was stiff. It lacked the fluid, natural pressure of a person writing their own name. It was drawn, not written. But a forged signature alone is not enough to secure a 6-figure mortgage. The bank requires identity verification. They require a notary public to stamp the document, swearing under penalty of perjury that the person signing the paper is exactly who they claim to be. I turned to the notary acknowledgement section attached to the deed of trust. My eyes scanned the boilerplate legal text, looking for the mechanism they used to bypass the identity check. And then I saw it. The document had not been signed by my grandmother directly. It had been signed by Richard Avery, acting as attorney in fact for the borrower, my father. I sat back in the hard wooden chair, the breath rushing out of my lungs in a sharp, quiet exhale. The puzzle pieces violently snapped together, forming a picture so sickening I actually felt my stomach turn. 5 years ago, when my grandmother briefly fell ill with a severe bout of pneumonia, she had drawn up a general power of attorney document. She named my father as her agent, giving him the temporary legal authority to manage her medical bills and handle her banking while she was hospitalized. When she recovered a few months later, the crisis passed, but my father had quietly kept the original notarized power of attorney document safely tucked away in his home office. What my father either did not know or deliberately chose to ignore is a fundamental foundational rule of estate law. A power of attorney legally dies the exact second the principal person dies. The moment my grandmother took her last breath a year ago, that piece of paper became completely worthless. It ceased to be a legal instrument and became nothing more than a historical artifact. Using a deceased person's power of attorney to execute a new financial contract is not a loophole. It is not a clever family shortcut. It is textbook mortgage fraud. My father had walked into a regional bank, presented a legally dead document to a careless or complicit loan officer, and fraudulently claimed he still had the active authority to encumber his dead mother's estate. He had essentially stolen $350,000 from a dead woman. I sat in the quiet archives room listening to the low hum of the fluorescent lights, tracing my father's signature with the tip of my index finger. The sheer staggering scale of the betrayal was almost impossible to process. This was no longer just a story about a greedy sister and emotionally abusive parents. This was not a simple family dispute over wedding dates and country club galas. My father had committed a federal crime. I pulled out my notebook and began mapping the flow of the stolen cash. I knew my parents' financial habits too well. The money would not be sitting safely in a savings account. It was already gone. They had tapped the equity line to its absolute maximum limit. $350,000 pulled out of thin air, injected directly into the rotting, diseased veins of our family's lifestyle. I visualized the massive country club ballroom. I thought about the 12-piece live brass band, the imported floral installations cascading over the tables, the premium top-shelf liquor flowing into crystal glasses. Lexi's extravagant $60,000 revenge party was entirely funded by mortgage fraud. She was going to stand on a stage in a custom designer gown, pitching her brilliant creative vision to local investors, while standing on a mountain of stolen money. And the remaining $290,000, I knew exactly where that went. Lexi's commercial warehouse rent had been brought current. Her outstanding vendor debts had miraculously vanished. My father had likely paid off his own suffocating credit card balances. They had used my grandmother's sacred home as a limitless piggy bank to finance their delusions of grandeur. They had sacrificed the only piece of real security this family had left entirely to spite me. A wave of profound, righteous fury washed over me, burning away any lingering shreds of daughterly obligation I still carried. For my entire life, I had been conditioned to believe that I was the problem. I was the selfish one for wanting to keep my own paycheck. I was the difficult one for asking questions. They had gaslit me into believing that my wedding was a trivial, egotistical party that deserved to be crushed under the weight of Lexi's superior ambitions. They had spent the last month calling every aunt, uncle, and cousin we shared, weeping on the telephone about how deeply I had hurt them. They had orchestrated a massive community-wide smear campaign, painting me as a ruthless, unsupportive monster who abandoned her family in their darkest hour of need. They had successfully managed to empty out my entire side of the church, leaving me to face my wedding day surrounded by empty wooden pews, feeling like an orphaned bride. And they had financed that entire humiliation with a felony. They did not just abandon me. They broke federal banking laws to afford the weapons they used to destroy my reputation. They forged documents, lied to a financial institution, and committed blatant estate fraud, simply because I refused to hand over $25,000. I gathered the stack of printed documents, aligning the edges perfectly. I slipped them into my manila folder and secured the metal clasp. The paper felt heavy, loaded with a destructive power that my parents could not even begin to comprehend. They thought I was just a quiet, invisible accountant who would eventually retreat into the shadows and cry. They thought their country club gala was the ultimate victory lap. They had absolutely no idea that they had just handed a commercial risk analyst a complete documented paper trail of their own financial ruin. I walked out of the municipal building and stepped back into the bright autumn sunlight. The air tasted incredibly sweet. I did not feel sad anymore. The hollow, suffocating grief that had been crushing my chest for the past month was completely gone, replaced by a cold, surgical clarity. My father had built his entire retaliatory empire on top of a massive, fragile glass floor, and I was holding the hammer. I got into my car, placed the manila folder carefully on the passenger seat, and started the engine. I was not going to call the police right away. I was not going to send an angry text message or demand a dramatic confrontation in their living room. That is what amateur emotional people do. I was going to let them have their party. I was going to let Lexi put on her expensive dress and drink her stolen champagne. I was going to let them stand in that lavish ballroom and smile for the cameras, firmly believing they had won the war. Because when the hammer finally came down, I wanted them to be standing at the absolute highest possible altitude. I wanted the fall to be spectacular. I drove home with the speed limit, my hands relaxed on the steering wheel, completely at peace. The family bank was permanently closed, but the auditing department was fully open for business, and I was about to collect every single debt they owed me with interest. I sat in the high-backed leather chair of an independent estate attorney I had researched the night before. Her name was Sylvia Sterling, and her office smelled of polished mahogany and expensive black coffee. I had a plain manila folder resting on my lap. Inside that folder was the undeniable proof that the man who raised me had committed a federal crime. I had spent my entire adult life trying to be the perfect daughter, trying to earn a permanent seat at my parents' table by paying their bills and keeping my mouth shut. Now I was sitting in a quiet room, preparing to hand over documents that would likely send my own father to prison. The drive to the law office that morning had been the longest commute of my life. I kept both hands perfectly steady on the steering wheel, but my mind was spinning through 1,000 different terrible scenarios. I am a commercial risk analyst. I deal with corporate liabilities and asset protection every single day. But nothing prepares you for the absolute devastation of auditing your own family and discovering they have stolen a small fortune from a dead woman. My father had used an expired power of attorney to forge my late grandmother's signature. He had taken out a $350,000 home equity line of credit against her fully paid-off Victorian house. He had stolen that money to pay off my sister's commercial warehouse debts and to fund a $60,000 country club gala designed specifically to overshadow my wedding day. Sylvia sat across the wide desk from me. She was a woman in her late 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and an absolute calmness that made me feel like I could finally put my heavy burden down. I opened the manila folder and slid the bank notices, the forged loan origination documents, and the copies of the deed transfers across the polished wood. I told her everything. I kept my voice completely level. I did not cry. I laid out the timeline of my parents' sudden financial crisis, my refusal to hand over my wedding savings, and the miraculous appearance of this massive loan just weeks later. I told Sylvia that I fully expected I would have to call the police. I told her I knew the exact legal definition of mortgage fraud and wire fraud. I took a slow breath and admitted that I was terrified of what this would do to the family. But I could not allow my father to desecrate my grandmother's estate to fund my sister's delusions of grandeur. I sat back in the heavy leather chair and waited for the attorney to tell me how to contact the federal authorities. Sylvia did not immediately reach for her telephone. She did not express shock or outrage. People who spend 30 years working in estate law rarely gasp at the terrible things family members do to one another when they think no one is looking. Instead, she picked up the documents and read them with slow, deliberate precision. She adjusted her reading glasses and examined the forged signature on the loan agreement. Then she opened her computer terminal and accessed the county property records database to pull up the complete historical file on my grandmother's Victorian house. The office was so quiet, I could hear the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner of the room. I watched Sylvia read the screen. I watched her scroll through the digital archives. And then I saw something completely unexpected happen. Sylvia Sterling smiled. It was not a small, polite smile. It was a wide, deeply satisfied smile of a woman who had just found the absolute perfect winning card hidden at the bottom of the deck. She took off her reading glasses, folded her hands on the desk, and looked at me with an expression of profound respect. "Hannah," she said softly, "you are an incredibly smart woman. You found the fraud. You traced the money. You understood exactly what your father did. But there is one massive detail you missed, because you did not have access to your grandmother's original estate planning files." My heart skipped a beat. I asked her what she meant. Sylvia turned her computer monitor slightly so I could see the screen. She explained that my father had indeed walked into a regional bank and presented a forged power of attorney. He had indeed signed his dead mother's name to secure a massive line of credit. The bank underwriter had been sloppy. They had pushed the loan through based on the superficial paperwork my father provided. But my father had made a catastrophic assumption. He assumed that because he was her only living son, the house automatically belonged to him upon her death. He assumed he had the right to borrow against it. But the house did not belong to him. It had never belonged to him. "Your grandmother was a remarkably brilliant woman," Sylvia explained, her voice carrying a quiet thrill. She knew exactly who her son was. She knew Richard was terrible with money. She knew he had a lifelong habit of making reckless financial decisions and expecting other people to bail him out. And she absolutely knew that if she left that beautiful house to him, he would immediately leverage it to the hilt and lose it to the bank. I leaned forward in my chair, hanging on her every word. My grandmother had always been the one person who saw me clearly. She was the one who taught me to save my allowance to balance a checkbook and to never let anyone make me feel small. I should have known she would not leave her legacy completely unprotected. Sylvia pulled up a digitized document that made my breath catch in my throat. It was the original master trust agreement my grandmother had drafted and legally recorded 7 years before she passed away. "Your grandmother did not leave the house to your parents," Sylvia said, tapping the screen. "She placed the property into a highly specific, irrevocable trust, and she included what we call a springing clause. It is a legal mechanism designed to automatically transfer ownership only when a specific predetermined condition is met." I looked at the complex legal jargon on the screen, unable to process the magnitude of what I was reading. I asked Sylvia what the condition was. The attorney leaned back and folded her arms. "The trust clearly dictates that the Victorian house and all its equity are held safely in a protective holding status. The property transfers exclusively, entirely, and irrevocably to you, Hannah. But your grandmother knew you were young when she drafted this. She wanted to make sure you were fully established before you took on the responsibility of a major real estate asset." Sylvia paused and let a warm smile cross her face again. "The deed springs directly into your name upon your 30th birthday, or the exact day you legally sign a valid marriage certificate, whichever milestone happens to come first." I sat completely frozen in the leather chair. The words washed over me like a sudden rush of clean, cold air. My grandmother had built an invisible, impenetrable shield around my inheritance. She had known my parents would try to strip the house for cash. She had known they would try to bully me out of what was rightfully mine. So she locked the asset away in a legal vault that absolutely no one in the world could open until I reached an age of maturity or started my own family. She had protected me from beyond the grave. But the true genius of the situation, the absolute staggering poetic justice of it all, had not entirely hit me yet. My mind was still processing the fact that I was the sole legal owner of the estate. I looked at Sylvia completely bewildered. "If the house is locked in a trust," I asked slowly, "how did my father manage to get a $350,000 loan approved?" "He lied," Sylvia stated bluntly. "He committed textbook bank fraud. He used a legally dead document to pose as an active agent for a woman who passed away a year ago. The regional bank made a massive underwriting error by failing to properly verify the actual chain of title before issuing the funds. They handed him a fortune based on smoke and mirrors. But that money is tied to a property he has absolutely zero legal right to encumber." I stared at the mahogany desk, feeling the sheer weight of my father's arrogance. He had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars believing he was the rightful heir, taking an advance on his own property. He had used that stolen money to fund Lexus' extravagant country club gala and pay off her failing business debts. He had used my grandmother's legacy to finance a massive spiteful party designed entirely to ruin my wedding day. And then the realization struck me with the force of a freight train. I looked up at Sylvia, my eyes wide. "My wedding day," I whispered. Sylvia nodded, her smile widening into something almost triumphant. "Yes, Hannah, your wedding day." I ran the calculations in my head. My parents had intentionally chosen October 14th for Lexus' massive relaunch gala. They had deliberately selected the exact date of my wedding to force our entire extended family to choose a side. They wanted to publicly humiliate me while they drank top-shelf liquor and celebrated their stolen wealth. They thought they had orchestrated the perfect, flawless revenge. But they had no idea what October 14th actually meant for their financial survival. Sylvia leaned forward and outlined the trap that my parents had blindly walked right into. She explained the precise mechanics of how modern banking and title systems communicate with each other. It was a masterpiece of automated corporate security. Right now, Sylvia explained, the bank thinks the loan is perfectly secure because the property is quietly sitting in the trust holding pattern. But the very moment you sign your legal marriage certificate on October 14th, that document becomes a matter of public record. The springing clause in your grandmother's trust is instantly legally activated. The title of the Victorian house officially shifts out of the trust and directly into your individual name. I listened, feeling my pulse begin to race. I asked what happens to the bank loan when the title shifts. "That is the beautiful part," Sylvia said. "Major lenders use automated title monitoring software to constantly scan county records for any changes to properties they hold liens against. They do this to prevent unauthorized sales. Within 48 hours of your marriage license being recorded, the system will automatically flag the sudden change in ownership. Sylvia's voice grew incredibly serious, carrying the full weight of the law. The software will alert the bank's risk management department. The auditors will pull the file. They will immediately see that the person who took out the home equity line of credit, Richard Avery, is not the legal owner of the property. They will realize he used a fraudulent power of attorney. She let the reality of the situation settle over the room. Hannah, you do not have to call the police. You do not have to lift a single finger to expose your father. The bank is going to do it for you. The second they realize they have issued a massive unsecured loan based on forged documents, their fraud department will instantly freeze all of his remaining accounts. They will initiate a federal investigation to recover their stolen funds. And because the money was transferred across state lines to pay Lex's various vendors, it officially becomes wire fraud. I sat back in my chair, completely overwhelmed by the absolute perfection of the trap. My parents had spent an entire month executing a vicious smear campaign against me. They had called every aunt, uncle, and cousin, painting me as a selfish monster. They had convinced our entire church congregation to boycott my wedding. They had spent $60,000 of stolen money to rent an exclusive ballroom, hire a 12-piece band, and throw a massive party entirely to spite me. They had chosen October 14th specifically to break my heart. And they had absolutely no idea that October 14th was the exact day the invisible trapdoor would open beneath their feet. By demanding I cancel my wedding, they were actually trying to delay the very mechanism that would destroy them. By refusing to bend to their will, I was walking directly toward the trigger that would expose their massive federal crime. The very act of marrying Thomas, the man they claimed was tearing our family apart, was the key that would officially lock them out of the vault forever. I looked at the forged documents resting on the desk. For my entire life, I had been the family fixer. I had been the one expected to write the checks, balance the budgets, and save them from their own reckless mistakes. I had spent 29 years trying to manage their chaos. But sitting in that quiet office, I realized I did not have to fix this. I did not have to stop them. My grandmother had already handled the risk assessment. She had built a brilliant, flawless system designed to protect me from the greed of her own son. So what do we do now? I asked, looking at the brilliant attorney across from me. Sylvia gathered the papers and placed them neatly back into the manila folder. She handed the folder back to me with a reassuring, confident nod. We do nothing, Hannah, she said smoothly. We let the trust do exactly what it was designed to do. You go home. You enjoy your final weeks of planning. You put on your beautiful dress and you marry the man you love. You let your parents put on their expensive clothes and host their extravagant stolen party. You let them believe they have won. She smiled, handing me her business card. Because on Monday morning, the bank is going to wake up, and your father is going to learn a very hard lesson about borrowing against a house he does not own. I walked out of the law office and back into the bright autumn sunlight. The heavy, crushing weight that I had been carrying for the last 4 weeks was completely gone. I did not feel sad. I did not feel angry. I felt an incredible, profound sense of peace. I got into my car, placed the folder on the passenger seat, and drove toward home. I was going to have a wonderful wedding, and my parents were going to have a spectacular, unforgettable fall. The final 7 days before you get married are universally described as a whirlwind of panic and last-minute details. Brides talk about losing sleep over flower arrangements, delayed caterers, and complicated seating charts. But the week before my wedding was characterized by a profound, heavy silence. It was the kind of total suffocating stillness that blankets a landscape right before a massive storm breaks the sky wide open. I had already taken a thick black marker and permanently crossed out every single member of my bloodline from my seating board. Thomas and his wonderful family had absorbed all the leftover chaos of the planning process. They insulated me with a fierce, protective warmth that left me with absolutely nothing to do but wait for Saturday to arrive. I was no longer an anxious bride trying to appease a hostile family. I was a commercial risk analyst sitting on a ticking time bomb of federal evidence, just watching the digital clock count down to zero. Every morning I woke up in the quiet house I shared with Thomas and drank my coffee while looking out the window at the crisp autumn leaves. I knew exactly what was happening across town. I knew my father was sweating through his shirts as he tried to manage the logistics of a $60,000 gala he had funded with a forged signature. I knew my mother was directing caterers and florists with her usual tyrannical flair, entirely blind to the fact that the financial ground beneath her designer shoes was completely hollow. They had stolen a fortune from my late grandmother to finance their petty revenge against me. They had committed a federal felony to ensure my sister could sip expensive champagne in a country club ballroom on the exact night I was saying my vows in a small local church. And they truly believed they had gotten away with it. It was exactly 6 days before the wedding on a gloomy Monday afternoon, when the illusion of our separation was abruptly shattered. I was standing in my kitchen, carefully pressing the wrinkles out of my veil with a handheld steamer. Thomas was at work, and the house was perfectly quiet. Then the heavy brass knocker on my front door sounded with 3 sharp, aggressive thuds. I did not expect any deliveries. I turned off the steamer and walked into the entryway, looking through the narrow glass pane beside the door. My breath caught sharply in my throat. Patricia was standing on my front porch. My mother was wearing a tailored wool coat and her signature pearl earrings, looking every inch the wealthy matriarch she so desperately pretended to be. But my professional eyes immediately caught the subtle fraying edges of her performance. Her posture was rigidly tight. Her jaw was clenched, and her hands were gripping her leather purse so hard her knuckles were stark white. She did not look like a woman dropping by to offer a heartfelt maternal apology to her estranged daughter. She looked like a woman who had just hit a brick wall at 60 miles an hour and was looking for someone else to pay the towing bill. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. I did not invite her inside. I simply stood in the frame blocking the entrance and looked at the woman who had orchestrated my social execution. Hannah, my mother said, her voice dripping with that manufactured honey sweetness she only used when she was backed into a corner. I know things have been incredibly tense between us lately. I know feelings are hurt. But we are still family, and family has to put aside their petty differences when it really matters. I stared at her, completely mesmerized by the sheer audacious scale of her delusion. This was the exact same woman who had looked me dead in the eye and told me to cancel my wedding so my sister could pay her warehouse rent. This was the woman who had spent an entire month calling every relative we shared, weeping fake tears, and labeling me a greedy, unsupportive monster. And yet here she was, standing on my porch trying to invoke the very concept of family she had so brutally weaponized against me. I kept my face perfectly blank. "What do you want, Mom?" I asked, my voice stripped of all emotion. She sighed dramatically, pressing a hand against her chest, as if my coldness was a physical injury. "Lexi's gala is..." This Saturday, she began, her words rushing out in a tight, anxious stream. "It is going to be the most spectacular event this town has ever seen. The investor list is absolutely incredible, Hannah. She is going to secure nationwide funding, but we have run into a tiny temporary logistical snag with the bank." I did not blink. I just let her talk. "There was a minor security flag on your father's accounts," she explained, waving her hand dismissively, as if a federal banking freeze was just a pesky administrative error. "The bank temporarily froze the outbound transfers while they verify some standard identity paperwork. It will be completely cleared up by next week, but the country club caterer is demanding the final $10,000 deposit by tomorrow morning, or they are threatening to pull their entire service staff. We simply cannot have a premium open bar and a live band with no food for the investors." My mother took a step closer, invading my personal space, looking at me with wide, desperate eyes. "I need you to write a check for $10,000 today, Hannah. I promise your father will reimburse you the very second the bank lifts the temporary security hold." The irony of her request was so profoundly thick, I could practically taste it. The bank had not frozen my father's accounts over a minor security flag. I knew exactly what had happened. My father had maxed out the fraudulent $350,000 home equity line of credit. He had drained the stolen funds completely dry, paying off Lexi's massive commercial debts and fronting the exorbitant deposits for the country club. He had pushed the stolen money to its absolute limit, and the bank had likely cut off his access when the numbers stopped making sense. They were drowning in a sea of premium floral arrangements and brass bands, and they had run out of stolen cash right before the final catering bill came due. And my mother, having exhausted every single fraudulent avenue available to her, had actually driven to the home of the daughter she had disowned to demand $10,000 to save the very party designed to ruin my life. "Mom," I said, keeping my voice dangerously soft. "You stood in your living room and told me my wedding was just a party. You told me if I did not give you my savings, I was no longer part of your family. You convinced every single aunt and uncle to boycott my ceremony. And now, you are standing on my porch asking me to fund the catering for the event you scheduled to humiliate me." Patricia's warm maternal mask instantly disintegrated. The honey completely vanished from her voice, leaving behind nothing but harsh, bitter entitlement. Her eyes went cold and her face hardened into a vicious glare. "You are so incredibly selfish, Hannah." She spat, her words landing like stones on the wooden porch. "Your sister is trying to build a legacy. She is trying to create something that actually matters. You have thousands of dollars sitting in a bank account doing absolutely nothing, while your own flesh and blood is facing a crisis. If you do not write this check today, the caterers will walk, the investors will starve. Lexi will be a laughingstock." She pointed a trembling finger directly at my face, delivering her final desperate ultimatum. "If you let your sister's business fail on Saturday, you will never be welcome in our home again. Do you understand me? You will be permanently dead to this family." I looked at the trembling finger pointed at my face. I looked at the angry, desperate woman who had forged a dead woman's signature to finance a lie. I did not feel a single ounce of fear or intimidation. I did not feel the familiar childhood urge to shrink myself to make her comfortable. I felt a profound, soaring sense of freedom. She had absolutely no idea that the home she was threatening to banish me from legally belonged to me. She had no idea that the bank she thought was just running a routine security check was about to become the primary witness in a federal fraud investigation. I looked my mother directly in the eyes. I let a slow, calm, genuine smile spread across my face. It was the smile of a commercial risk analyst who had completely balanced the ledger. "I will not be paying for Lexi's party, Mom," I said, my voice ringing with absolute finality. "I am keeping my money for my marriage. You and Dad made your choices. You signed the papers. You booked the ballroom. You are going to have to figure out how to feed your own guests." I took a step back and placed my hand on the heavy brass doorknob. "I hope Saturday gives you everything you deserve," I told her. Then I firmly closed the front door, locking the deadbolt, with a loud, definitive click. I watched through the narrow glass pane as my mother stood on the porch in absolute stunned silence. Her mouth was slightly open. She could not comprehend that the vending machine was permanently broken. She finally spun around on her heels, marched aggressively down the concrete path to her car, and sped away down the street, leaving a cloud of exhaust in her wake. I walked straight into my home office and picked up my cell phone. I did not call Thomas. I did not call my future in-laws to complain about the harassment. I dialed the direct private extension of my independent estate attorney, Sylvia Sterling. She answered on the second ring, her voice crisp and professional. "She came to the house," I told Sylvia, getting straight to the point. "They are out of money. The bank froze my father's access to the credit line, and they are $10,000 short on the final catering deposit for the country club. My mother just tried to extort me for the cash." I heard the sound of Sylvia shifting papers on her heavy mahogany desk. "They tapped out the entire fraudulent equity line in less than 4 months," the attorney noted, her tone reflecting a mixture of professional disgust and legal fascination. "That is a staggering burn rate, Hannah. Your father must have panicked when the remaining balance hit zero. They are flying completely blind right now." "Are we absolutely secure for Saturday?" I asked, my eyes fixed on the calendar hanging above my computer monitor. "I need to know that the trap is fully functional." Sylvia assured me with the confident, unwavering tone of a lawyer who has orchestrated hundreds of complex asset transfers. "We are perfectly locked and loaded, Hannah," she explained methodically. "I have spent the last 3 days coordinating with the county clerk's electronic filing system. Your grandmother's trust is a beautiful, ironclad piece of legal architecture." She walked me through the exact logistical sequence of the trap we had set. The springing clause in my grandmother's trust dictated that the title of the Victorian house would officially automatically transfer to me the moment I signed my legal marriage certificate. But in the modern digital age, property transfers do not just happen in dusty archives. They are processed through high-speed electronic county databases that talk directly to national banking networks. I have the deed transfer documents fully prepared and resting in a secure digital queue. Sylvia explained, her voice humming with precision. The very minute your wedding ceremony concludes and the officiant signs your marriage license, I want you to send me a text message. A simple thumbs up will do. The exact second I receive that message from you, I am going to hit execute on my terminal. I listened intently, visualizing the data moving through the servers. The electronic filing will instantly record the deed transfer with the county, Sylvia continued. The property will immediately shift out of the holding trust and directly into your individual name. And because your father recently took out a massive home equity line of credit against that specific property address, the bank's automated title monitoring software is currently watching that parcel number like a hawk. It was a masterpiece of corporate risk management working entirely in my favor. Banks do not lend $350,000 without attaching digital tripwires to the collateral. Within a matter of hours, Sylvia said the bank system will detect the sudden change in ownership. It will generate a high-priority alert to their central fraud department, indicating that the collateral securing Richard Avery's loan has just been legally transferred to a third party. The risk management auditors will pull the physical file. They will examine the original loan origination documents. They will look at the power of attorney your father provided, and they will immediately see that the power of attorney was legally expired before the loan was ever requested. I finished the sentence for her, feeling a cold thrill run down my spine. Exactly, Sylvia confirmed. They will realize he forged a dead woman's signature and used an invalid document to steal their money. The bank will not wait for a polite explanation. They will instantly trigger a full systemic freeze on every single account associated with your parents' social security numbers. Checking, savings, credit cards, all of it will be completely locked down by the Federal Compliance Division while they initiate criminal recovery protocols. I thanked Sylvia and ended the call. I sat in my quiet office looking at the framed photograph of Thomas and me on my desk. My parents had spent their entire lives treating me like a disposable asset. They had demanded my wedding savings to fund their fake luxury lifestyle, and when I refused, they had tried to utterly destroy my happiest day. They had driven my extended family away and isolated me, believing they could break my spirit. But they had made one fatal miscalculation. They forgot that they raised an auditor. They forgot that I make my living reading the fine print and calculating the exact moment a bad investment is going to collapse. They thought October 14th was going to be the day they publicly humiliated me in a grand empty church, while they danced in a country club ballroom. They had absolutely no idea that Saturday was not just my wedding day. It was the exact deadline for their financial execution. I picked up my steamer, walked back into the kitchen, and went back to preparing my veil. I was going to be a beautiful bride, and my family was going to get exactly what they had earned. If you have ever had to quietly prepare a boundary while someone mistreated you, you know the exact kind of calm I felt that week. Drop a comment below with your city and time, and make sure you subscribe, because you will not want to miss how this wedding day actually ends. October 14th arrived with the kind of crisp and unapologetic blue sky that makes everything in the world look sharper than usual. The morning air was cold and biting, but I did not feel a single chill as I stood by the large window of the bridal suite at our small local church. I looked out over the quiet stone courtyard, watching leaves the color of burnt copper and bright pennies gather along the pathways. It was a completely peaceful morning. There was no rushing, no frantic screaming, and no heavy anxiety pressing down on my chest. I felt an incredible sense of clarity. Across town, I knew the scene was entirely different. I could easily picture the chaotic, frantic energy buzzing through the grand ballroom of the Oakwood Country Club. I could imagine my mother barking aggressive orders at caterers she had paid with stolen funds, desperately trying to maintain the illusion of extreme wealth. I could picture Lexi steaming her designer gown, completely oblivious, or perhaps entirely indifferent to the fact that her luxurious business relaunch was built on a foundation of felony fraud. They were undoubtedly rushing around high on the thrill of their own spite, absolutely confident that their spectacular $60,000 revenge plot was going off without a single hitch. They believed they were writing the ultimate victory story. Inside the sunlit room at the church, there was only the steady and reassuring hum of genuine love. Thomas's mother stood behind me, her warm hands gently adjusting the delicate pearl buttons running down the back of my white lace dress. Her eyes were bright with quiet, unshed tears, and she kept smoothing my veil with a tenderness my own mother had never once offered me. His sister was nearby, humming a soft melody while she carefully arranged my bouquet of autumn roses. I looked at my reflection in the tall antique mirror resting in the corner of the room. I did not look like the invisible, dependable vending machine daughter who had spent 29 years begging for scraps of basic affection. I looked like a woman who was stepping into a life she had deliberately chosen, surrounded by people who actively chose her back. The heavy oak doors of the sanctuary opened. The organist began to play a soft classical piece, the beautiful notes rising and swelling into the high wooden rafters of the church. I stood at the threshold, holding my bouquet tightly, my heart beating a steady, deliberate rhythm against my ribs. I had made the firm decision to walk myself down the aisle. I did not need someone to give me away because I was finally taking complete ownership of myself. I took my first step onto the long carpeted runner. As I moved forward, I instinctively looked to my left. It is one thing to mentally prepare for the fact that your family is not coming to your wedding. It is an entirely different, highly visceral experience to look at the physical evidence of their absence. Row after row of polished wooden pews sat completely vacant. There were no aunts whispering in their Sunday hats. There were no uncles checking their watches. There were no cousins shifting restlessly in their seats. The entire network of people who shared my blood, the people who had watched me grow up, had collectively agreed to abandon me. My parents had successfully weaponized an entire community, guilting every single relative into boycotting my wedding to attend a fraudulent business pitch instead. They had willingly traded my milestone for a glass of stolen champagne and a beautifully packaged lie. A sudden sharp pang of grief hit me right in the center of my chest. It was a heavy, breathless ache. It was the final, unavoidable mourning of the family I was supposed to have. The family I had spent my entire adult life trying to buy with loan payments and bailed-out credit cards. For 3 agonizing seconds, the empty space on the left side of the church felt like a massive, suffocating void. The silence from those empty benches was deafening. But then I took another step. I turned my head away from the vacant wooden pews and looked straight down the center aisle. Thomas was standing at the altar. He looked incredibly handsome in his dark suit. But it was not his clothes that caught my attention. It was his eyes. They were locked onto me with a fierce, unwavering devotion that made the rest of the room completely blur into the background. Behind him, the right side of the church was absolutely packed. Every single seat was filled with his family, our mutual friends, colleagues who supported us, and neighbors who genuinely cared. They were smiling brightly. Some were wiping their eyes with tissues. They were entirely beautifully present. I looked back at Thomas, and the heavy ache in my chest completely evaporated. The void vanished. The grief washed out of my body, leaving behind a profound, crystalline clarity. I realized in that exact moment that the empty pews on the left were not a tragedy. They were a cleared ledger. The bad debts had finally been written off, and the liabilities had been permanently removed from my life. I did not need the people who were currently standing in a country club ballroom trying to tear me down. I had everything I ever wanted waiting for me right at the end of this runner. I walked the rest of the way with a genuine, radiant smile. The ceremony was intimate, deeply personal, and completely unbothered by the ghosts across town. We held hands. We spoke the vows we had written ourselves, promising to build a partnership rooted in honesty, respect, and mutual shelter. We did not need $60,000 of stolen money to make the moment sacred. We just needed the truth. When the pastor finally pronounced us husband and wife, the applause from the right side of the church was so loud and so full of joy that it echoed beautifully off the stained glass windows. Thomas kissed me, and I felt a soaring, untouchable sense of victory. But the true victory, the absolute legally binding reckoning, was still a few minutes away. The recessional music played, and we walked back down the aisle together, stepping out of the main sanctuary and directly into the quiet, hushed space of the church vestry. The pastor followed us, carrying a heavy leather-bound folder. The vestry smelled of old paper, burning candle wax, and polished wood. A sturdy mahogany desk sat in the center of the small room, bathed in the soft afternoon light pouring through a narrow frosted window. I glanced at the vintage grandfather clock standing quietly in the corner. The brass hands read exactly 3:15 in the afternoon. The pastor opened the leather folder and smoothed out the official state marriage certificate. He handed Thomas a heavy black fountain pen. Thomas smiled at me, leaned over the desk, and signed his name with a quick, confident flourish. Then he handed the pen to me. The metal barrel felt cool and solid against my fingers. I looked down at the document resting on the wood. This piece of paper represented the beginning of my beautiful new life with my husband. But because of my brilliant, forward-thinking grandmother, it also represented something much sharper and far more dangerous. It was the absolute undeniable trigger mechanism for the trap my parents had blindly walked into. I pressed the nib of the pen to the heavy paper and signed my name. The ink flowed smoothly, leaving a dark, permanent record of my new legal status. The pastor took the paper, reviewed our signatures to ensure everything was correct, and pressed his heavy official embossed stamp onto the bottom corner. A loud, satisfying click filled the small room. It was done. It was legally, irreversibly finalized. I handed the pen back to the pastor, reached into the hidden pocket of my white lace dress, and pulled out my cell phone. Thomas watched me with a knowing, quiet smile. He knew exactly what this specific moment meant. He knew the sheer gravity of what was about to happen. I opened my camera application, held the phone directly over the stamped, fully executed marriage certificate, and made absolutely sure the focus was crystal clear. I tapped the screen and captured the image. Every signature, every date, and the official state seal were perfectly legible. I opened my email client and attached the high-resolution photograph. I typed in the direct private email address of Sylvia Sterling, my independent estate attorney. I did not write a long, triumphant message. I did not need to explain anything or offer any emotional commentary. I simply typed 2 words in the subject line: execute transfer. I took a steady breath and hit the send button. I watched the little blue progress bar shoot across the top of my screen. The email vanished into the digital ether, traveling instantly from the quiet church vestry to a secure legal server downtown. I slid the phone back into my pocket and turned to my husband. The gears of the legal machinery were officially in motion, and nothing in the world could stop them now. Miles away in an office, smelling of polished mahogany and expensive black coffee, I knew exactly what was happening. Sylvia was sitting at her computer terminal, waiting for the notification. The moment my email arrived, she would open the attachment, verify the timestamp and the official stamp on the certificate, and immediately turn to the state electronic filing system she had carefully queued up days ago. With a few swift, deliberate keystrokes, she would submit the formal deed transfer documents to the county recorder's office. The digital packets would hit the municipal servers instantly. The property records for the Grand Victorian House would update in a matter of seconds. The protective holding status of the irrevocable trust would formally dissolve, having successfully fulfilled its ultimate purpose. The title to the sprawling, valuable estate would shift. It would become legally, publicly, and undeniably mine. And the moment that electronic transfer locked into the county database, the $350,000 home equity line of credit my father had fraudulently acquired would instantly lose its collateral anchor. My risk analyst brain visualized the magnificent invisible digital war that was actively unfolding while I stood in my wedding dress. I knew exactly how modern banking systems operated. Major lenders use automated title monitoring software to constantly scan county records for any changes to properties they hold massive liens against. They do this to prevent unauthorized sales and to protect their capital. Within 48 hours of that deed transfer hitting the system, the software would automatically flag the sudden change in ownership. It would generate a high-priority alert to the bank's central fraud department, indicating that the collateral securing Richard Avery's massive loan had just been legally transferred to a third party. The risk management auditors would pull the physical file. They would examine the original loan origination documents. They would look at the power of attorney my father provided, and they would immediately see that the document was legally expired before the loan was ever requested. They would realize he had forged a dead woman's signature and used an invalid document to steal their money. The bank would not wait for a polite explanation. They would instantly trigger a full systemic freeze on every single account associated with my parents' social security numbers. Checking accounts, savings accounts, credit cards, all of it would be completely locked down by the Federal Compliance Division while they initiated criminal recovery protocols. And because the money was transferred across state lines to pay Lexi's various luxury vendors, it officially became wire fraud. The trap was completely flawlessly sprung. Across town, my parents were likely raising crystal glasses of expensive champagne, toasting to Lexi's brilliant future. They were standing under glittering chandeliers, listening to a live brass band, completely oblivious to the fact that their financial foundation had just been utterly pulverized. They were standing on a trapdoor, smiling for the flashing cameras, unaware that the floorboards had just been violently pulled away. They believed they had won the ultimate victory by stealing my guests and ruining my day. They did not realize that their loud, expensive, fraudulent noise was no match for my quiet, devastatingly effective silence. I stood in the vestry and let the reality of it wash over me. I did not feel angry. I did not feel vindictive or cruel. I just felt incredibly safe. I had spent my entire life trying to fix their mistakes, trying to save them from their own reckless behavior. But my grandmother had built a brilliant, flawless system designed to protect me from the greed of her own son, and I had simply allowed the system to work. Thomas reached out and gently touched my arm, pulling me from my thoughts. I looked at him, feeling a wave of pure happiness. The bad debts were gone. The liabilities were erased. We were completely free to start our new life together, totally unburdened by the toxic demands of the people who had abandoned me. I took his hand, walked out of the small room, and headed toward our reception to celebrate a beautiful future that absolutely nobody could ever steal from me again. I sat at a small, dimly lit table with my new husband, watching our closest friends laugh and share stories in the quiet reception hall. It was a modest celebration, but it was incredibly warm. The food was simple, the music was soft, and the people who were there actually wanted to be there. I felt a profound sense of peace. But exactly 12 miles across the city, inside the gilded walls of a premier golf and country club, the atmosphere was entirely different. Lexi was in her element. She was wearing a custom silk gown that cost more than my entire wedding budget, holding a microphone and standing on a raised stage. The grand ballroom was dripping with imported white orchids. A 12-piece brass band rested their instruments while she commanded the room. Our aunts, uncles, and cousins, the very people who had abandoned my church just hours earlier, sat at tables draped in heavy satin, sipping premium champagne. They were captivated by Lexi's speech about her brilliant entrepreneurial vision and her resilient comeback. My mother, Patricia, sat at the front table beaming with pride, wearing her finest jewelry. My father, Richard, leaned back in his chair, swirling a glass of expensive scotch, looking like a man who had successfully conquered the world. They were absolutely convinced they had won. They thought their $60,000 revenge party was a flawless masterpiece. But grand illusions require constant funding. At exactly 9 o'clock in the evening, the catering and events manager quietly approached my father's table. The manager was a tall, impeccably dressed man who handled high-net-worth clients for a living. He carried a sleek black leather folder. Inside that folder was the final invoice for the evening. The open bar, the premium-plated dinners, the stage rental, the security, and the imported floral arrangements had all reached their contractual limit. The outstanding balance was exactly $45,000 due immediately before the dessert course could be served. Richard did not flinch. He smiled, radiating false confidence, and pulled a heavy metal debit card from his wallet. It was the card directly linked to the home equity line of credit he had illegally secured against my late grandmother's Victorian estate. He handed the card to the manager with a casual flick of his wrist, playing the role of the wealthy patriarch perfectly. He told the manager to put it all on that account and to add a generous tip. The manager nodded politely, pulled a small mobile payment terminal from his jacket pocket, and inserted the metal card. The machine processed for 3 seconds. Then a sharp, angry red light flashed on the digital screen. The word "declined" appeared in bold letters. The manager discreetly cleared the screen and tried the transaction a second time. The machine hummed, connected to the banking network, and returned the exact same red error message. The manager leaned down and spoke in a very low professional whisper, informing my father that the card was not going through. Richard's smile faltered, but he quickly masked it with irritation. He blamed the machine. He blamed the country club's wireless internet connection. He patted his pockets, pretending it was just a silly administrative error, and told my mother he needed to step out into the hallway to call the bank's 24-hour customer service line to clear up a routine security flag. He stood up, adjusted his suit jacket, and walked out of the ballroom entirely unaware that he was walking into a nightmare he could not escape. The hallway outside the ballroom was lined with thick acoustic carpet and velvet wallpaper, making the space eerily quiet. Richard dialed the premium banking number on the back of his card. He bypassed the automated system and was connected to a high-tier client representative. He demanded to know why his transaction was being blocked, puffing out his chest and using his most authoritative, demanding voice. He expected the representative to apologize profusely and lift the restriction immediately. Instead, the voice on the other end of the line was painfully cold and strictly professional. The representative asked my father to verify his identity. Once confirmed, the representative delivered the devastating news. The account was not experiencing a routine security flag. The home equity line of credit had been permanently frozen by the National Fraud Prevention Division. Richard demanded an explanation, his voice rising in panic. The representative read directly from the automated risk management report. At 3:15 that afternoon, the county recorder's office had formally processed a deed transfer for the collateral property. The Victorian house had officially shifted out of a protective holding trust and directly into the individual name of Hannah Avery, a married woman. My father's blood ran completely cold. The representative continued, stating that their title monitoring software had instantly flagged the transfer. When the auditing department pulled the origination file, they discovered a catastrophic discrepancy. The power of attorney Richard had used to sign the loan documents was legally expired before the application was ever submitted. The bank had determined that the property did not belong to him. The signature on the deed of trust was fraudulent, and the collateral securing the loan was entirely invalid. The account was locked, the remaining funds were seized, and the legal department had already been notified of suspected felony mortgage fraud. Richard stood in the quiet velvet-lined hallway, the color completely draining from his face. The phone nearly slipped from his sweating fingers. The trap had snapped shut. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. My wedding was not just a family milestone he had successfully ruined. My wedding was the exact legal trigger that activated my grandmother's springing trust. By legally signing my marriage certificate that afternoon, I had instantly taken ownership of the estate and exposed his massive financial crime to the federal banking system. Every single dollar he had spent on Lex's lavish party was stolen money, and the bank had just cut the cord. Inside the ballroom, Lexi was pacing across the stage, holding her champagne flute high, delivering a tearful emotional toast about overcoming adversity. The brass band was preparing to play the next set. My mother was clapping enthusiastically. Then Richard walked back into the room. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. He was pale, trembling, and breathing heavily. He stumbled toward Patricia's table and collapsed into his chair. The catering manager, who had been patiently waiting near the kitchen doors, immediately approached their table again. He asked my father for an alternate form of payment. Richard just stared at the tablecloth, unable to speak. Patricia, noticing her husband's absolute terror, sharply asked the manager to give them a minute. But the manager refused. He politely but firmly stated that $45,000 in services had already been rendered. The food had been eaten, the alcohol had been consumed, and the vendors were requiring their contractual compensation immediately. If a valid payment method was not provided within the next 10 minutes, he would be forced to contact the local authorities to report a massive theft of services. Patricia's jaw dropped. She looked at Richard, demanding he pull out another credit card. But Richard just shook his head, his hands trembling violently. Every single account they owned was tied to that bank. Every asset was frozen. They had absolutely nothing left. The illusion of wealth was over. The catering manager did not wait the full 10 minutes. He recognized a fraudulent situation the moment he saw a sweating silent host unable to produce a working card. He raised his hand and gave a sharp, definitive signal to his staff. The resulting chaos was incredibly swift and absolutely brutal. The sound technician abruptly cut the power to the main stage. Lex's microphone went dead right in the middle of her inspirational speech. She tapped the microphone, looking confused and annoyed, shouting at the soundboard operator to turn it back on. But the technician was already packing up his cables. The brass band stopped playing, unclipped their sheet music, and began putting their expensive instruments back into their velvet-lined cases. A small army of waitstaff marched into the ballroom. They did not pour more champagne. They began rapidly clearing the tables. They pulled half-eaten plates of food away from my aunts and uncles. They carted away the remaining bottles of premium liquor. The beautiful imported floral centerpieces were swiftly lifted from the tables and carried back toward the loading dock. The luxurious gala was being dismantled in real time, right in front of every single investor and family member they had invited to witness their triumph. The guests sat in stunned, uncomfortable silence. My cousin Sarah, who had sent me that self-righteous text message condemning my wedding, sat at table 4 clutching an empty wine glass, looking utterly bewildered as a waiter snatched the breadbasket from under her hand. My Uncle Robert, who had claimed I was a selfish bridezilla, watched the brass band walk out the back door. The whispers began immediately. The extended family who had so willingly abandoned my church to attend a high society event suddenly realized they were sitting in the middle of a massive financial disaster. Lexi ran off the stage, her heavy silk gown dragging across the floor, demanding to know what was happening. She shrieked at Patricia, throwing a massive tantrum, screaming that her entire professional reputation was being destroyed in front of local investors. Patricia was hyperventilating desperately, digging through her designer purse for a credit card she knew would not work. Richard just sat frozen in his chair, staring blankly at the empty table, completely paralyzed by the terrifying reality that he was likely going to prison. The revenge party had collapsed into an absolute humiliating catastrophe. The desperation set in instantly. Patricia pulled out her cell phone. She knew exactly why this was happening. She knew I held the key. The woman who had sworn I was dead to her, the woman who had proudly orchestrated my isolation, suddenly realized that her estranged daughter was the only person on earth who could save them from public ruin and criminal charges. Miles away, Thomas and I had just finished dancing. We said our goodbyes to his wonderful family, hugged his mother, and walked out into the cool, refreshing autumn night. We got into the back seat of our waiting car, perfectly content and incredibly happy. The streetlights passed by in a warm, comforting blur. I reached into my purse and pulled out my cell phone just to check the time. The screen illuminated the dark interior of the car. My notification center was completely overwhelmed. I had 47 missed calls, 47 desperate, frantic attempts to reach me in the span of 30 minutes. There were text messages from my mother typed in rapid-fire succession, with terrible spelling and missing punctuation. The preview text flashed across my screen. Hannah, please pick up the phone right now. Hannah, you have to call the bank. Hannah, tell them it was a misunderstanding. Please release the deed back to your father. The caterers are threatening to call the police. Everyone is watching us. Hannah, please, you are ruining our lives. They were begging me. They were pleading with the exact same daughter they had tried to destroy. They wanted me to call a federal banking institution and lie for them. They wanted me to surrender my grandmother's legal protection just to save them from the consequences of their own felony. I looked at the scrolling list of frantic messages and missed calls. I read the absolute panic in my mother's words. I thought about the empty pews in the church that afternoon. I thought about the years of emotional abuse, the constant demands for money, and the vicious way they had tried to isolate me. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel the slightest urge to call them back or fix their problems. I simply turned the phone to silent mode, slipped it back into my purse, and leaned my head against my husband's shoulder. The panic belonged to them now. The silence was finally mine. Sunday morning arrived with a kind of brilliant, piercing sunlight that felt like a personal reward. I woke up slowly in my own bed, feeling the unfamiliar, wonderful weight of my new wedding band against the cotton sheets. The house was entirely silent, save for the soft sound of Thomas making coffee in the kitchen downstairs. I lay there for a long time, looking up at the ceiling, feeling a profound and unshakable sense of safety. There was no anxiety sitting heavy on my chest. There was no knot of dread twisting in my stomach about what my parents might demand from me next. The long, exhausting war of my adult life was finally over, and I had woken up completely free. I eventually got out of bed, wrapped myself in a thick robe, and walked over to the dresser where I had left my cell phone the night before. I had silenced it right after the wedding reception, knowing that the digital avalanche of their panic would only interrupt my joy. I tapped the screen, and the device lit up with the catastrophic wreckage of their evening. There were dozens of new messages, frantic missed calls and voicemails that ranged from furious demands to hysterical sobbing. My mother had left a rambling, breathless audio message begging me to call the bank and authorize a release of the deed, claiming that the police were currently interviewing the catering manager in the country club lobby. My father had texted me an aggressive paragraph demanding I answer my phone immediately, completely ignoring the fact that he was the one who had committed a federal crime. Lexi had simply sent a string of capitalized words, blaming me for destroying her entire future. They were thrashing in the deep water, desperately reaching for the safety raft they had spent 29 years trying to sink. I carried the phone downstairs, poured myself a cup of black coffee, and sat at the kitchen island. Thomas walked over, kissed the top of my head, and sat down next to me. He did not ask what I was going to do. He just rested his hand over mine and waited. I did not call them back. I did not record a tearful video or draft an emotional response about how much they had hurt me. Emotional responses are exactly what manipulative people thrive on. They use your anger as proof that you are the unreasonable one. They use your grief as an opening to negotiate their way out of accountability. I was a commercial risk analyst, and I knew that the absolute best way to handle a compromised asset is with cold, indisputable documentation. I opened my email and downloaded the 3 digital files my attorney Sylvia had sent me for my personal records. The first file was the official fraud alert generated by the regional bank detailing the frozen home equity line of credit. The second file was a scanned copy of the forged power of attorney my father had submitted to secure the loan. The third file was the authentic legally binding distribution schedule of my grandmother's irrevocable trust, plainly showing my name and the springing clause tied directly to my marriage. I opened a new text message on my phone. I did not just add my parents and my sister to the recipient list. I methodically went through my contacts and added every single aunt, uncle, and cousin who had boldly returned a declined RSVP to my wedding. I added Uncle Robert, who had told me I was selfish. I added cousin Sarah, who had sent me that self-righteous paragraph about unsupportive behavior. I added every single family member who had gleefully chosen to attend a country club gala to spite a bride on her wedding day. I built a digital audience of 45 people. I attached the 3 PDF documents to the group message. I made sure the files were fully loaded and ready to open. Then I typed a single devastatingly precise message. You skipped my wedding to attend a party funded by felony identity theft. The bank has all the documentation. Do not contact me again. I took a sip of my warm coffee, looked at Thomas, and pressed send. The delivery notification chimed softly. I set the phone face down on the granite counter and let the digital shockwave wash over my entire extended family. I did not need to be in their living rooms to know exactly what was happening. I could perfectly envision the chaos spreading from phone to phone across town. Uncle Robert and cousin Sarah were likely opening the documents over their Sunday morning breakfast, their smug satisfaction instantly evaporating as they read the official banking alerts. The extended family who had spent the entire month believing they were taking a noble moral stand by supporting a struggling entrepreneur were suddenly staring at the undeniable proof that they had been drinking expensive champagne at a crime scene. They had not been guests at a glamorous society event. They had been unwitting accessories to a massive $60,000 fraud. The absolute horror of that realization must have hit them like a physical blow. The typing indicators on my phone screen began to flash wildly as aunts and cousins desperately tried to distance themselves from the wreckage. A flood of incoming messages began to ping. There were frantic apologies, claims that they had absolutely no idea where the money came from, and desperate pleas for me to understand that my parents had lied to them. I did not read a single one of those apologies. I blocked every single number on the thread, completely sealing the vault door on the family I no longer recognized. The public fallout over the next few weeks was swift and completely merciless. You cannot keep a secret in a community when caterers, florists, and 12-piece brass bands are left holding unpaid invoices. Lex's grand business relaunch was dead on arrival. The wealthy local investors she had invited to the gala had watched her father fail to produce a working credit card, while the waitstaff literally pulled the food off their tables. In the business world, a public financial humiliation of that magnitude is a death sentence. When rumors of the bank fraud began to circulate, the investors ran in the opposite direction. The vendors who had been hired for the gala immediately filed civil suits against Lex's company for theft of services. Her staging business, already completely hollowed out by massive debt, went into immediate freefall. With no access to my stolen wedding funds and no more fraudulent equity lines to tap, Lexi was forced to file for total commercial bankruptcy within a month. The spectacular legacy she had tried to build on my pain crumbled into absolutely nothing. But Lex's bankruptcy was merely a footnote compared to the catastrophic legal nightmare facing my parents. The regional bank did not care about family drama or wedding dates. They cared about a $350,000 unsecured liability. The federal bank fraud investigation moved with the terrifying speed and efficiency of an institution determined to recover its capital. Richard and Patricia were formally notified that they were the targets of a criminal inquiry. The forged power of attorney and the subsequent wire transfers to various country club vendors constituted serious federal offenses. My parents were staring down the very real, very terrifying prospect of serving hard prison time. They hired a frantic, expensive defense attorney to try and negotiate their way out of a federal indictment. The prosecutors made it incredibly clear that the only way to avoid a trial and potential incarceration was to provide immediate full financial restitution to the bank. The illusion of their wealthy, superior lifestyle evaporated overnight. Richard and Patricia were forced into an emergency liquidation of every single asset they actually owned. They had to sell their 2 luxury vehicles, replacing them with a cheap, heavily used sedan. They were forced to completely drain their retirement accounts, taking massive early withdrawal penalties just to access the cash. They sold my mother's designer jewelry, the expensive artwork in their home, and every piece of furniture that had any resale value. They handed over every single dollar they had spent a lifetime accumulating, pouring it all directly into the gaping hole of the fraudulent bank loan. They avoided a federal penitentiary by the skin of their teeth, accepting a brutal plea deal that left them with a permanent criminal record and absolutely zero financial security. They were reduced to nothing, living in a quiet, suffocating house, entirely isolated from the community they had tried to manipulate. Meanwhile, Thomas and I moved forward with absolute unbroken peace. The grand Victorian house my grandmother had left me was beautiful, but it was heavily tethered to the geographic center of a family I had permanently erased from my life. I had no desire to live in a town where people knew my parents' crimes. I met with a real estate agent and listed the property. Because it was a fully paid-off, pristine historic estate, it commanded a massive premium on the market. It sold to a lovely young family within 2 weeks. I took that clean, legally protected money and used it to completely fund the purchase of a beautiful modern home in a completely different city, hours away from the toxic gravity of my past. Thomas and I unpacked our boxes in a spacious, sunlit living room that belonged entirely to us. We bought new furniture. We planted a garden in the backyard. We built a life that was completely insulated from demands, guilt trips, and emotional extortion. I had a thriving career, a wonderful husband, and a home filled with genuine joy. I had lost a toxic family, but I had gained the entire world. Looking back on the chaotic weeks leading up to my wedding, the most profound lesson I learned was the absolute undeniable power of total silence. When you are raised in a family that uses guilt as a currency and volume as a weapon, your first instinct is always to fight back. You want to scream your side of the story. You want to beg them to understand your worth. You want to stand in their living room and demand the love and respect you have spent your whole life trying to earn. I spent 29 years believing that if I just explained my spreadsheets clearly enough, if I just proved my financial loyalty consistently enough, they would finally see me as an equal. But manipulative people do not care about your logic, and they do not respect your tears. They only respect leverage. When my parents crossed the ultimate line and used a felony to try and destroy my wedding day, the old version of me would have called them immediately. I would have warned them about the trust. I would have tried to save my father from the bank investigation, because I had been conditioned to believe that their ruin was somehow my responsibility. The new version of me, the commercial risk analyst who had finally audited her own heart, simply closed the ledger. I learned that you do not have to participate in the chaos other people design for you. You do not have to attend every argument you are invited to. When people are determined to orchestrate their own spectacular downfall, the absolute best thing you can do is get out of the blast radius and let gravity do its job. I did not scream. I did not beg them to love me. I simply stopped protecting them from the consequences of their own horrific actions. The most powerful thing you can do when someone shows you who they are is step back and let the world see it too. You do not need to seek revenge when the truth is already carrying a hammer. You just have to be patient enough to let the truth strike the anvil. I allowed my parents to build an entire empire of lies, and I watched with perfect calm as it collapsed exactly when it was supposed to. I walked away with my dignity, my finances, and my sanity entirely intact. If you have ever had to legally protect yourself from the people who were supposed to be your family, let me know in the comments below. Drop your city and the time you are watching this. I read every single one. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more stories where dignity wins out over drama. See you in the next one.